Carl Jung lived in an age before the term burnout existed. Yet, he recognized it in the faces of the men and women who came to him, worn down not just by their work but by the weight of a society that demanded endless productivity while starving the human soul. To Jung, this exhaustion was spiritual, a collapse that occurred when life became too mechanical, too divorced from the deeper currents of meaning. In his writings and therapy, Jung described what happens when the inner life is neglected. He believed the modern person had grown obsessed with outer achievement, climbing higher, earning more, keeping pace with industry and technology. But behind these triumphs lurked a dangerous shadow. When the psyche is reduced to a tool for output, when imagination and reflection are treated as luxuries, the soul begins to revolt. This revolt, Jung suggested, manifests as fatigue, depression, and a haunting sense of emptiness that many today would recognize as burnout. Unlike Freud, who emphasized childhood conflicts, Jung focused on the cultural and spiritual conditions that shape our lives. He saw the 20th century accelerating into a storm of machines, factories, and mass movements. He was troubled not by technology itself, but by how it disconnected humans from their inner ground. He wrote that modern people had become overwhelmed by their tools, enslaved to progress that promised comfort but delivered restlessness. Even then, Jung noticed the paradox. The more society achieved outwardly, the more individuals felt hollow within. This hollowness, he warned, could not be filled by more work, success, or possessions. That path only deepened the weariness. Burnout, in Jung's view, was not just exhaustion, it was the psyche's protest, a signal that life was drifting too far from its center. He called this center the self, the deeper totality of the personality, and believed everyone had a responsibility to align with it. If ignored, the self forced its presence into awareness through symptoms, anxiety, fatigue, and the sense that one's efforts were meaningless. To Jung, this inner collapse was not a weakness but a message. He urged his patients to treat their exhaustion as a summons to turn inward, to listen to the soul. He saw burnout not as individual failure but as a cultural epidemic, born of an age that worshipped speed and efficiency at the expense of reflection and wholeness. The banker who could no longer face his office, the housewife trapped in endless duties, the soldier broken by mechanized war, all were victims of the same imbalance, a world where the outer mask of productivity had crushed the inner need for meaning. Jung's insight was radical because he insisted the solution lay not in temporary rest or distraction, but in a deeper reorientation of life. Rest was necessary, but only as a doorway. The true task was to rediscover a relationship with symbols, myths, and the unconscious, the sources of renewal that industrial society had dismissed. Without this connection, he warned, exhaustion would return endlessly, regardless of rest or vacation. This is why Jung spoke so often of dreams. He believed they were the hidden medicine for modern fatigue, messages from the unconscious revealing what the conscious mind had neglected. Where society demanded rational planning, dreams brought irrational images. Where the workplace demanded control, dreams offered mystery. To Jung, paying attention to dreams was not indulgence, it was survival. It was how the psyche replenished itself in a draining world. Jung's vision of burnout reached even further. He believed it pointed to the loss of ritual in modern life. He argued ancient societies had ceremonies to mark transitions, spaces for withdrawal, and myths that gave suffering meaning. Modern life stripped these away, leaving people to push forward without pause, without acknowledging their inner thresholds. In this void, exhaustion was inevitable. A culture that does not honor the psyche's need for rhythm, Jung warned, will drive its people into collapse. Yet he also saw in burnout the possibility of transformation. When a person could no longer bear the demands of their outer role, they were forced to ask, who am I beyond my work, my duties, my masks? This painful question opened the door to individuation, the process of aligning with one's true self. What looks like failure or fatigue may be the beginning of a deeper journey. Burnout was not only an end but also a threshold. This perspective makes Jung startlingly relevant today. Long before smartphones and 24-hour connectivity, he grasped the psychological cost of endless demands. He understood that the crisis of exhaustion was not simply about working too hard but about living without balance, myth, or soul. To Jung, burnout was modernity's great warning sign, a symptom that humanity had lost its dialogue with the inner life. He counseled patience. He urged people not to treat exhaustion as a problem to be solved quickly, but as a profound signal of what had gone missing. The cure was not found in rushing back to the treadmill, but in rediscovering the forgotten language of the soul, the silence, the symbols, the stories that restore life to its deeper roots. Jung often described individuation as the great task of a human life. It was not about efficiency, not about performing more, but about becoming whole. And this, he believed, was where modern exhaustion carried a hidden meaning. For when someone reaches the breaking point of burnout, when all the outer roles and expectations finally collapse under their weight, a space opens. Painful though it may be, this collapse strips away illusions. What remains is the raw confrontation with the question of who one truly is. In his clinical work, Jung saw this again and again. The businessman who could no longer bear the grind of endless competition, the young woman whose depression left her unable to keep up appearances, the intellectual whose nervous collapse shattered his pride, each was forced to step out of the old pattern. At first, this was experienced as disaster. But Jung urged them to see it differently. Burnout, he told them, was the psyche's way of withdrawing energy from a false path, a way of refusing to cooperate with a life lived only for external demands. He once remarked that people do not suffer because they work too hard, but because they work without meaning. The human being, he said, cannot live on bread alone, nor on paychecks, nor on social approval. We require connection to what he called the numinous, those moments of contact with mystery that lift life beyond the flat routines of survival. Without this, work becomes sterile, and fatigue grows unbearable. Burnout, then, is the soul's revolt against a life drained of the sacred. For Jung, individuation did not mean rejecting the outer world entirely. One must still work, still live among others, still participate in society. But it meant shifting the center of gravity from outside to inside, from chasing recognition to listening to the unconscious. This was not an escape, but a transformation of orientation. A life lived from the self was not less engaged but more real, more rooted, less likely to be torn apart by exhaustion. The danger, Jung warned, was that modern people often misread the call. Instead of seeing burnout as a summons to inner work, they tried to outrun it. They sought stimulation, distraction, new achievements, hoping that if they just did more, the emptiness would vanish. But this only deepened the crisis. He wrote that what modern humanity needed was not greater speed, but a return to stillness. The fatigue so many carried was not a sign of weakness but a sign of having ignored the inner voice for too long. In his own life, Jung did not escape this confrontation. After his break with Freud, he experienced years of inner turmoil that nearly overwhelmed him. He described this time as being abandoned by the spirit of the times and forced into a confrontation with the depths of his own unconscious. What sustained him was not more work or more outward accomplishment, but his descent into imagination, his dreams, his visions, his dialogues with the inner figures that emerged. Out of this period, he developed his most profound insights, and he later reflected that it was precisely in this collapse that his real life began. This autobiographical truth gave weight to his counsel. Jung was not simply a theorist but a man who had walked through the darkness of inner exhaustion. He knew how terrifying it was to lose the scaffolding of outer certainty. He knew how burnout stripped a person of their familiar identity. And yet he insisted, if one listens, if one allows the psyche to speak, what looks like ruin can become revelation. This is why he valued symbols so deeply. For in moments of collapse, reason often fails. Logical explanations cannot soothe the soul's fatigue. But a symbol, whether in a dream, a myth, or an image, speaks directly to the depths. It offers orientation when the conscious mind is lost. Jung saw in these symbols the seeds of renewal, tiny sparks of the self reaching into awareness, guiding the exhausted individual back toward meaning. Individuation, then, was not a grand achievement to be earned after success, but something born precisely in the midst of breakdown. Burnout was one of its gateways. A person who had been living only as a mask, an efficient worker, a loyal role player, was forced to shed that mask. The energy withdrawn from false life could then be reinvested in a truer one. This reinvestment was slow, fragile, and required patience. But it was, in Jung's view, the only path toward wholeness. Thus, when Jung spoke of the modern crisis, he did not see it as merely unfortunate. He saw it as a historical necessity. The rise of burnout in industrial society was the psyche's way of demanding a new balance, not just for individuals but for the culture as a whole. A civilization obsessed with progress had to be reminded of the inner world it had forgotten. The exhaustion of its citizens was not a side effect but a message, a collective symptom pointing toward the need for renewal. To recognize this is to shift the meaning of our suffering. Burnout is no longer only a private misfortune. It is the voice of the unconscious calling us to recenter, to ask deeper questions, to step out of the machinery of endless demands and reclaim the path of individuation. And though the journey is painful, Jung believed it was also the path to healing, not just for individuals, but for an entire age. Jung's exploration of burnout could never be separated from his understanding of archetypes. For him, exhaustion was not merely a matter of overwork, it was a sign that the fundamental energies of the psyche, the archetypal forces that move beneath consciousness, were being neglected or distorted. When a life is lived without contact with these deep patterns, the result is a draining disconnection. A person works harder and harder, yet feels emptier with each effort. Archetypes, in Jung's view, were not abstract theories. They were living patterns within the unconscious that gave shape to human existence. The archetype of the mother, for example, spoke to our need for nurture and belonging, the hero to our drive toward struggle and transformation, the wise old man to our longing for guidance. These patterns appeared in myths, dreams, and symbols across cultures. And Jung observed that when they were ignored, their energy did not simply vanish, it turned against the individual, often in the form of fatigue, anxiety, or collapse. Burnout, then, could be seen as a rebellion of the archetypal world. A man who identified only with the hero, striving, conquering, pushing beyond his limits, eventually found himself broken, not because he lacked strength, but because he refused to listen to the archetype of the healer or the lover, the parts of himself that demanded rest, renewal, and connection. A woman who lived only through the archetype of the caregiver, giving endlessly to others, could fall into despair if she neglected the call of her own inner self. Jung warned that when life becomes one-sided, when a person sacrifices the fullness of their psyche for a single role, exhaustion is inevitable. In this sense, burnout was not simply a warning, it was an archetypal correction. It forced a confrontation with the neglected parts of the psyche. The hero was reminded that he could not conquer everything. The caregiver was reminded that she, too, needed care. The archetypes demanded balance, and when denied, they expressed themselves through collapse. Jung often said that neurosis, what we today might call depression or burnout, was the result of a split in the psyche, a failure to integrate the totality of one's inner life. He saw this most vividly in dreams. A patient might come to him exhausted, unable to work, and in their dreams would appear images of water, forests, or ancient figures. To Jung, these were not meaningless fantasies but urgent messages. Water, for example, often symbolized the need to return to the unconscious, to let go of rigid control and allow life to flow again. A wise old figure appearing in dreams could symbolize the archetype of inner guidance, offering the exhausted individual a path forward. Where the modern mind dismissed such dreams as nonsense, Jung insisted they carried the medicine for burnout. But Jung's insight went further still. He believed that entire cultures could fall into archetypal imbalance. The modern West, in his eyes, had become enslaved to the archetype of the hero, the endless drive for progress, conquest, and productivity. This heroic one-sidedness produced dazzling achievements, but also left the collective psyche deeply weary. The archetype of the sage, with its wisdom of reflection, was neglected. The archetype of the child, with its playfulness and renewal, was forgotten. In such a culture, burnout was not just an individual malady but a collective symptom of imbalance. And here lay one of Jung's most haunting warnings. If the archetypal energies of the psyche are ignored for too long, they do not merely fade away. They erupt. He saw in the wars and political upheavals of the 20th century the destructive return of neglected archetypes. When people failed to honor the inner figures of myth and dream, those figures returned on a massive, destructive scale in the form of ideologies, fanaticism, and violence. Burnout, in this sense, was the gentler warning, the early signal that something was deeply out of harmony. Thus, Jung urged his patients, and in a sense, the modern world, to make room for these neglected energies before they erupted uncontrollably. To take dreams seriously, to honor the imagination, to make space for ritual and reflection, was not a luxury but a necessity. Without such attention, the psyche forced its demands to exhaustion, stripping away the ability to function until one could no longer ignore the inner world. What strikes us today is how precisely Jung foresaw the psychological landscape of our own age. In a world that demands constant achievement, the archetype of the hero dominates our culture more than ever. Social media rewards conquest and comparison. Workplaces celebrate relentless drive. And yet beneath it all, millions collapse into burnout, their souls crying out for the archetypes that have been cast aside, the dreamer, the healer, the child, the wise guide. Jung would not have been surprised. He saw it coming long before we gave it a name. For him, the path forward was never about rejecting the outer world. It was about integrating it with the inner. The hero must learn humility before the sage. The caregiver must learn to receive from the inner mother. The exhausted person, in reconnecting with these archetypal forces, finds not just relief from fatigue but a deeper alignment with the fullness of life. Burnout, then, was not simply a collapse but an invitation to reintegrate the forgotten archetypes, to honor the wholeness of the psyche, and to step out of the narrow mask of one-sided living. Jung believed that if individuals, and cultures, could heed this call, exhaustion would no longer be the end of the story but the beginning of a more balanced, more human existence. Jung's vision of burnout was inseparable from his reflections on modern speed and technology. Even in his own lifetime, long before smartphones and digital screens, he saw how the accelerating tempo of life was damaging the psyche. He warned that humanity was moving too fast, creating a world in which silence had all but disappeared. Without silence, there could be no dialogue with the unconscious, and without that dialogue, there could be no renewal. He often spoke of what he called the spirit of the times, the dominant mindset of an age. In his era, this spirit was characterized by rationalism, efficiency, and faith in progress. He did not deny the brilliance of these achievements, but he feared what they cost. The spirit of the times had drowned out what he called the spirit of the depths, that ancient, timeless layer of the psyche that speaks through dreams, symbols, and myths. When people gave themselves entirely to the demands of progress, they silenced the depths. And it was from these depths, Jung insisted, that true vitality came. Burnout was the price of forgetting this balance. Jung understood technology as a double-edged force. It could liberate, but it could also enslave. Machines, he wrote, were wonderful servants but dangerous masters. The danger lay not in the tools themselves, but in the way they seduced humanity into constant motion, constant striving, constant distraction. If the machine was allowed to dictate the rhythm of life, the human psyche suffered. People became like their tools, efficient, precise, productive, but drained of mystery, of depth, of soul. Exhaustion was not an accident of modernity but its inevitable consequence when technology replaced silence and ritual. He worried, too, about the fragmentation of attention. Long before social media, Jung noted how modern people could no longer concentrate inwardly. Their minds were scattered across endless duties, schedules, and noise. He believed the psyche required intervals of stillness, like the fallow season of the earth, to replenish itself. Without this, the unconscious could not speak. Dreams dried up, imagination withered, and life became a flat routine. Burnout, he said, was what happened when the soil of the psyche was never allowed to rest. Jung himself practiced what he advised. He often retreated to his tower at Bollingen, a stone house he built by hand on the shores of Lake Zurich. There, without electricity or modern distractions, he lived in a rhythm closer to the natural world. He carved stones, tended a garden, sat in silence by the water. It was not escapism. It was medicine. Balingen gave him the silence to hear the depths of his own psyche, to remain rooted in symbols rather than consumed by noise. For him, this was essential not only to his own sanity but to his ability to guide others. He believed that every person needed some form of this silence, some refuge where the unconscious could be heard. Looking at our present age, it is easy to see how his warnings have only intensified. The spirit of speed has multiplied beyond anything Jung could have imagined. Smartphones, emails, algorithms, tools designed to capture attention without pause, have created a world in which silence has nearly vanished. The psyche, unable to rest, revolts in the only way it can, through exhaustion, anxiety, and collapse. Burnout is not a sign that something is wrong with the individual. It is a sign that something is wrong with the culture. Jung would likely remind us that this collapse carries meaning. He would tell us that when our devices leave us hollow, when our endless striving leaves us numb, we are being forced to confront the fact that no machine, no productivity system, no outward success can replace the nourishment of the soul. He would insist that we must carve out spaces of stillness, whether in nature, in art, in ritual, or in simple silence. Only in such spaces can the unconscious renew us. Without them, burnout becomes the defining illness of the age. For Jung, then, technology was not to be rejected, but balanced. The machine could serve us only if we remembered that we are not machines ourselves. We are beings with an inner life that demands rhythm, mystery, and depth. To ignore this truth is to invite collapse. To honor it is to rediscover what it means to be fully human. This was perhaps Jung's deepest warning about modern burnout, that it is not only a psychological crisis, but a spiritual one. It reveals the cost of living entirely in the spirit of the times, cut off from the depths. And it invites us back, not backward into nostalgia, but downward into silence, into imagination, into the forgotten roots of the soul. For Jung, burnout was never the end of the story. He saw in it the threshold of something greater, the possibility of transformation, not only for the individual but for the entire culture. Collapse, in his philosophy, was not meaningless suffering. It was a demand from the unconscious, a summons to turn toward what had been neglected. The exhaustion so many feel today, the hollowness beneath constant striving, is not a private misfortune alone. It is a message whispered through millions of lives, telling us that we cannot continue in this way. He believed that humanity was always in dialogue with itself, consciously and unconsciously, and that when the conscious path became too narrow, the unconscious broke through. Burnout was one form of this breakthrough. It stripped people of the illusion that they could live only for external roles, worker, achiever, provider, performer, and forced them to ask, what lies beneath these masks? What is the deeper pattern of my life? What is the self asking of me? These questions, though painful, opened the way to individuation. Individuation, for Jung, was never selfish. It was not about withdrawing into isolation or rejecting the world. It was about living from a center that could carry the weight of both outer duties and inner truth. A person who had passed through burnout and listened to its message could return to life renewed, able to give without collapse, to work without emptiness, to engage without losing themselves. In this way, burnout became not just a warning, but an initiation. Jung often warned that if individuals ignored these initiations, the consequences would grow larger. The psyche does not forget what has been neglected. It forces recognition, whether through illness, breakdown, or collective crisis. Yet he also held hope that if people listened, if they honored silence, dreams, symbols, and the deeper rhythms of the soul, then burnout could mark the beginning of a new relationship between the individual and the culture. The very illness of the age could become its teacher. What makes Jung's insights so haunting today is how clearly they anticipate our own world. He foresaw the weariness of lives consumed by machines, the fragmentation of attention, the emptiness of constant striving. And he foresaw the danger of ignoring the inner life until it revolts. Yet he also offered a path, to see exhaustion not as failure, but as a summons. To step out of the cycle of endless productivity and return to what gives life depth, silence, imagination, myth, nature, and the symbols that connect us to the self. In this light, modern burnout becomes something more than a personal burden. It is a sign of our age's imbalance, but also a doorway. Each person who heeds its call and begins the slow, difficult journey inward becomes part of a larger healing. The culture that drives people into collapse is the same culture that can be renewed, if enough individuals remember that we are more than machines, more than workers, more than masks. Carl Jung did not give us easy answers. He never offered quick fixes. What he gave was something more demanding and more profound, a reminder that the soul has its own laws, and that to ignore them is to suffer. But to honor them is to rediscover life itself. Burnout, he warned, is the price of forgetting the self. Yet in remembering it, in turning inward and finding balance again, we do not merely recover our strength, we recover our humanity. And perhaps that is why Jung's warning still matters. For in an age of exhaustion, his voice calls us back to what cannot be measured, cannot be hurried, cannot be replaced. It calls us back to the silence beneath the noise, to the depths beneath the surface, to the soul that waits patiently, even now, for us to return. Carl Jung believed that unhappiness does not come merely from bad luck, poverty, or cruel circumstances. It comes, more terrifyingly, from within. He argued that most of our suffering is self-inflicted, born from what we refuse to see about ourselves. This is the dark truth at the core of Jung's psychology. We carry inside us forces so powerful and untamed that if we do not learn to confront them, they quietly devour our joy and make life feel hollow. For Jung, the human soul was not a simple, unified thing. He saw it as a battlefield, an uneasy meeting ground of opposites, light and dark, reason and madness, order and chaos. We like to believe we are only the part of ourselves we show to the world, the polite mask, the functioning adult, the responsible worker, the agreeable friend. But Jung insisted that this is only one layer, a fragile shell he called the persona. Beneath it lies everything we push away, our anger, envy, greed, lust, fear, selfishness, and despair. All that we cannot admit into the daylight, Jung gathered under one haunting name, the shadow. To live without acknowledging this shadow, Jung warned, is to live only half a life. Outwardly, we may appear respectable and successful, but inside, tension grows. The things we deny do not disappear, they fester. A man who refuses to acknowledge his capacity for cruelty becomes bitter and resentful. A woman who represses her ambition becomes secretly envious of those who dare to chase theirs. Jung saw unhappiness as the natural consequence of this inner split. We pretend to be whole while silently being torn apart. The tragedy is that most people never realize this. They chase happiness in the wrong places, in wealth, in status, in fleeting pleasures. But none of these can reconcile the fracture within. Jung wrote that whatever is denied comes back with a vengeance. The shadow finds ways of leaking into our lives, often when we least expect it. It appears in dreams, in sudden fits of anger, in the quiet dissatisfaction that lingers even when life appears perfect. It shows itself in the people we despise, for often what we hate in others is precisely what we cannot bear to face in ourselves. This was the dark truth Jung revealed, that you are unhappy not because the world is against you, but because you are against yourself. Every time you refuse to acknowledge your shadow, you deepen the war within. You become a stranger to yourself, divided between the image you present and the reality you suppress. The more successful you are at pretending, the more dangerous the shadow becomes because it grows in silence, waiting to erupt. And yet, Jung was not a pessimist. He did not say this to condemn humanity, but to free it. For him, the shadow was not merely evil, it was raw life. Within it lies not just our destructiveness but also our hidden strength, our creativity, our capacity for passion and truth. To deny the shadow is to deny half of existence itself. To integrate it is to become whole. But such integration requires an honesty so brutal that most people never dare to attempt it. It means confessing to yourself the darkest truths of your own nature, not to indulge them, but to understand them. Unhappiness, then, is the symptom of an unlived life. When the shadow is ignored, the soul withers. Jung believed that much of modern suffering, depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, comes not from external hardship, but from this quiet refusal to engage with the depths of the self. We construct a persona that pleases society, but in doing so, we betray the demands of our own spirit. The cost is a life that feels empty, even when surrounded by success. This is the beginning of Jung's warning and his invitation. To confront the shadow is terrifying, but to avoid it is fatal to the soul. The longer you run from it, the darker your unhappiness becomes because it is the part of yourself you cannot escape. For Jung, the refusal to face the shadow was not just a personal matter, it was a cultural disease. He believed modern life, with its comforts and distractions, gave people endless opportunities to escape themselves. Work, entertainment, social masks, these allowed individuals to avoid the silence where the shadow begins to speak. Yet, the more elaborate the escape, the more profound the emptiness. Jung warned that no amount of distraction can silence what is buried within. The shadow waits patiently, and when ignored for too long, it forces its way into life destructively. This is why Jung observed that many people collapse in midlife. Until then, they can sustain the illusion of happiness through ambition and achievement. But eventually, success stops satisfying. The persona cracks. A man who has built his identity on being a perfect husband and professional suddenly finds himself restless, irritable, haunted by unexplainable dreams. A woman who has lived only for others suddenly feels suffocated, resentful, and desperate for freedom. These crises, Jung said, are not random. They are the soul demanding recognition. They are the shadow crying out to be seen. But instead of listening, people often run harder. They change jobs, chase new relationships, buy possessions, drink, or numb themselves with endless activity. Jung compared this to trying to put out a fire by throwing more fuel on it. The external changes never resolve the inner conflict because the problem is not the world, it is the unfinished work within. Until that work is done, unhappiness returns in new forms, like a mutating disease treated superficially. The courage Jung demanded was radical, to stop running, to turn inward, and to face our deepest fears about ourselves. He knew how terrifying this was. He spent years wrestling with his own shadow, recording his visions and encounters in his Red Book, a text so personal and unsettling that he refused to publish it during his lifetime. In it, Jung documented the figures, voices, and forces that emerged when he confronted his inner chaos. He did not meet comfort there. He met the truth, in all its brutality. Yet, through this confrontation, he found renewal. Jung believed every person must undergo a similar descent to escape the prison of unhappiness. This descent into the self is not glamorous. It feels like madness, like walking willingly into darkness. But he argued it is the only path to wholeness. To see your shadow is to strip away the illusions about who you are. It is to discover that you are capable of cruelty, envy, weakness, and betrayal, and to accept this without collapsing into shame. It is to understand that what makes you human is not purity, but complexity. Here lies the paradox. Jung insisted that confronting the shadow does not destroy you. It makes you stronger. The parts of yourself you fear most, once integrated, become sources of vitality. Anger, when acknowledged, can transform into courage. Envy, once faced, can reveal suppressed desires. Even despair, when understood, can point toward a deeper meaning. But this transformation only occurs when the shadow is met with honesty, not denial. Unhappiness, in Jung's view, is a messenger. It signals that something essential has been neglected, that the shadow is demanding its rightful place in your life. Instead of cursing your unhappiness, he suggested listening to it. Behind the discomfort lies the truth of who you are. If you do not face it, the cost is not just sadness, it is the slow death of the soul. This was Jung's dark gift. He forced humanity to see that happiness is not achieved by polishing the persona, but by integrating the shadow. The question was never how to get rid of unhappiness, but how to understand what it reveals. To be whole, you must dare to face what you have most carefully hidden. For most, this is the hardest journey they will ever take. Jung often compared the human psyche to a vast landscape, most of which lies hidden beneath the surface. What we call the self is only a small island floating on an ocean of unconscious depths. The persona keeps us afloat in society, but beneath the waters live forces we cannot easily name: instincts, forgotten memories, forbidden desires, and the shadow itself. To ignore these depths is to live on a fragile island, pretending it is the whole world, while storms rise unseen below. This is why Jung insisted that true healing requires more than therapy, positive thinking, or chasing pleasure. It requires what he called individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the conscious and unconscious into a unified whole. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, it is about becoming real. It is the slow and painful work of bringing the shadow into dialogue with the light, allowing the fragmented pieces of the soul to recognize each other. But this path is terrifying because it requires sacrifice. To integrate the shadow, you must give up the comforting illusions you have built about yourself. You must confront the truth that you are not who you thought you were. Jung saw this as a kind of death, the death of the false self, the collapse of the persona. Many resist this because it feels like losing everything. But Jung insisted it is only through such a death that new life can emerge. The unhappiness people feel is, in part, resistance to this necessary transformation. They cling to masks that no longer fit, while the soul demands something deeper. To illustrate this, Jung often turned to myth and religion, for he believed myths are not just stories of gods and heroes, but reflections of the human psyche. In every myth of descent, Orpheus in the underworld, Christ in the tomb, Buddha beneath the tree, he saw an image of the individual confronting the darkness within. Happiness, he argued, is never found in avoiding this descent. It is found in surviving it, in discovering that the self is larger, stranger, and more resilient than the persona could ever allow. Jung also recognized how easily society conspires to prevent this process. Cultures reward conformity. They celebrate the persona, the good worker, the obedient citizen, the polite neighbor. But they rarely create space for the deeper journey of the soul. This is why Jung said the individual must often go against the collective to be whole. What society condemns as selfish or strange may, in truth, be the soul's demand for authenticity. And when that demand is silenced, the cost is profound unhappiness. He once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he did not mean this in the shallow, modern sense of chasing one's desires or personal brand. For Jung, becoming who you are meant confronting everything within you, the noble and the vile, the beautiful and the monstrous, and allowing them to coexist. Only then does life gain weight and meaning. Otherwise, it remains a performance, a fragile act that collapses the moment the mask slips. The dark truth Jung uncovered is that happiness cannot be given from outside. It cannot be bought, borrowed, or bestowed. It can only arise from the integration of the inner world. And this requires facing precisely what you fear to see. For most, unhappiness is not a sign of failure, but a summons. It is the soul demanding attention, urging you toward the difficult work of individuation. Ignoring this summons may bring temporary comfort, but it ensures deeper despair in the long run. And so, Jung's message strikes us as both a warning and a hope. If you are unhappy, it is not merely a curse. It is the beginning of transformation, if only you are willing to enter the depths. Jung knew that facing the shadow is not a one-time event, but a lifelong struggle. The shadow shifts, adapts, and deepens as life changes. To meet it once is not enough. The work must continue because the unconscious is inexhaustible. Every stage of life brings new shadows to the surface, new truths that must be faced. Those who stop the work inevitably fall back into dissatisfaction because the self cannot be fully contained. It keeps pressing forward, demanding recognition. He saw this most clearly in what he called the midlife transition, a period when the ambitions of youth begin to lose their power. Early life, Jung said, is about building the career, the family, the identity. We put on the mask of competence and success because the world requires it. But once this structure is built, something strange happens. It no longer satisfies. The old goals feel empty, and the mask grows heavy. This is when the shadow begins to speak most loudly. For Jung, this crisis was not a failure, but a turning point. It was an invitation to shift from an outer life to an inner one. If the first half of life is about conquering the world, the second half must be about understanding the soul. But many resist this shift. They cling to youth, ambition, and old identities that no longer fit. They try to drown the call of the inner world in distractions, affairs, addictions, endless busyness. Jung saw this refusal as one of the deepest sources of modern unhappiness. People reach the height of success, and yet feel nothing inside because they have neglected the soul's demand for depth. Jung's vision was radical because it suggested that unhappiness is not a flaw, but a message. Depression, boredom, and dissatisfaction are not simply conditions to be medicated away, but signals that something essential has been ignored. The modern tendency to treat unhappiness as an error, to escape it at all costs, struck Jung as profoundly dangerous. For him, unhappiness was the beginning of wisdom. It was the soul refusing to be silenced any longer. He warned that when unhappiness is denied, it becomes destructive. People project their shadows outward, blaming others for what they cannot face in themselves. Hatred of strangers, scapegoating, cruelty, even political violence. All of these, Jung believed, often grow from individuals and societies unwilling to face their own darkness. What is not acknowledged internally will be acted out externally. In this sense, personal unhappiness is not merely private, it has consequences for the whole world. And yet, Jung was not without hope. He believed that when a person dares to face their unhappiness honestly, something extraordinary happens. The shadow, once feared as an enemy, reveals itself as a guide. It shows where you have been false, where you have repressed life, where you must grow. It does not make the journey easier, but it makes it meaningful. Wholeness, Jung believed, was more important than happiness. To be whole is to live a life with depth, to accept both light and shadow, to carry the contradictions of existence with dignity. And paradoxically, this wholeness creates a deeper joy than the shallow happiness most people chase. This was the stark contrast Jung drew. You can avoid the shadow and remain comfortable, but secretly empty. Or you can confront it and endure pain, but discover a richer, truer existence. The unhappiness so many fear is, in fact, the doorway to transformation. But only if it is faced, not fled. Jung believed that the greatest tragedy of human life is not suffering itself, but suffering without meaning. Pain is inevitable, but when it is understood, when it is integrated, it can be transformed into something redemptive. What crushes people is not simply the burden of unhappiness, but the feeling that it is pointless, that it has no purpose. Jung's work was a call to see that unhappiness does, in fact, carry a message. It is not random, it is the voice of the unconscious, summoning you toward wholeness. He described this process as a dialogue between the ego, the conscious I you believe yourself to be, and the vast self, which includes not only the shadow but also the archetypes, the deep patterns of human experience stored in the collective unconscious. In Jung's vision, each person carries within them the accumulated wisdom of humanity, myths, symbols, images that have guided countless lives before. When you dream, when you are struck by a powerful emotion, when you feel the pull of something greater than yourself, it is this deeper self speaking. And unhappiness is often the doorway through which that voice is heard. But most people, Jung lamented, refuse the dialogue. They cling to their ego, to the fragile mask of who they think they are. They fight unhappiness as if it were a mistake, when in truth, it is the only thing capable of breaking the ego open. In trying to protect their identity, they suffocate their soul. The result is a life that looks stable but feels barren. People do not collapse because they suffer too much, Jung observed, they collapse because they suffer for nothing. The dark truth he revealed is that your unhappiness is not an enemy to destroy but a teacher to learn from. To listen to it requires immense courage, because it means admitting that the story you have told yourself about your life may not be true. It means accepting that the mask you have worn is not your face, and that the person you thought you were is only a fragment of a much larger whole. But if you can bear this, if you can stay with your unhappiness instead of fleeing it, the shadow begins to speak in a new language. It shows you the unlived life, everything you have repressed, denied, or buried. It forces you to see the paths you did not take, the truths you did not admit, the emotions you have numbed. For Jung, The unlived life is the heaviest burden a person carries. People are not destroyed by what they live through, he said, but by what they never allow themselves to live. The artist who silences their creativity becomes consumed by envy of others. The person who denies their capacity for love becomes bitter and cold. The one who rejects their own darkness becomes haunted by projections, seeing enemies everywhere. And so unhappiness festers, because the soul knows it has been betrayed. Yet Jung also insisted that it is never too late to begin the work. The shadow waits as long as it must. Even in old age, even after decades of denial, the work of individuation can begin. He told the story of patients who, late in life, confronted their shadows and found not despair, but peace. They did not erase their unhappiness, they gave it meaning. They saw that the purpose of life is not perfection, but integration, to bring together the fragments of the self, however jagged, into a whole. This is why Jung rejected the shallow pursuit of happiness as society defines it. He knew that happiness based on comfort, success, or external approval is fragile, easily shattered by illness, loss, or failure. True fulfillment, he argued, comes only from within, from the reconciliation of the conscious and the unconscious, from facing the shadow and allowing it to enrich life. Such fulfillment is deeper than happiness. It is a sense of wholeness, of being real, of standing firmly in the truth of your own complexity. To live this way is not easy. It requires enduring periods of darkness when nothing makes sense, when the soul feels like it is falling apart. Jung himself endured these times, wrestling with visions that threatened to overwhelm him. But he emerged with a conviction that the soul is stronger than the ego imagines. That beneath the unhappiness lies not only pain, but also vitality, creativity, and meaning. The darkness is not the end, it is the beginning of transformation. In this sense, Jung's philosophy is profoundly hopeful. He does not promise a life without unhappiness. He promises that unhappiness can be redeemed. That the very thing you most fear to face contains the key to your wholeness. That within the shadow lies not just despair, but also the energy you need to live fully. He once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This was his great gift to the modern world, the reminder that happiness is shallow, but wholeness is deep, and only wholeness can satisfy the soul. So if you feel unhappy, Jung would not tell you to run from it. He would not tell you to cheer up, distract yourself, or chase another goal. He would tell you to stop, to listen, to descend into the depths you have avoided. He would tell you that your unhappiness is not proof of your failure, but proof that your soul is still alive, still speaking, still demanding truth. He would tell you that the shadow you fear is not your enemy, but your other half, and that only by embracing it can you become whole. This is the dark truth Jung revealed. Unhappiness is not an error in life, but its teacher. It is the shadow knocking at the door of consciousness, asking to be seen. Ignore it, and you will live a hollow life, outwardly successful but inwardly barren. Face it, and you will suffer, but in that suffering, you will find transformation. The path is not easy, but it is the only one that leads to meaning. And meaning, Jung believed, is deeper than happiness. Meaning is what makes life worth enduring, worth suffering, worth living at all. Carl Jung once said that life really begins at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. It is a striking line because, at first, it sounds almost dismissive of the first 4 decades of existence, as if youth, ambition, and the restless years of building one's identity are nothing but preparation for something that comes later. But Jung was not undermining the vitality of youth. He was pointing to a deeper truth. The first part of life is largely lived under the shadow of other people's expectations, while the second half, if lived with courage, can finally become our own. In our 20s, we live outwardly. We strive to be what our parents, our culture, our peers, and even our own ego want us to be. We build careers, chase status, seek love, and try to plant ourselves firmly in the world. Jung saw this as the natural task of early life, the morning of existence. But like all mornings, it is not meant to last forever. A new sun eventually rises, and with it, a different responsibility. By the time a person approaches their 40s, Jung noticed a profound shift. The strategies that once gave meaning, ambition, conquest, proving oneself, begin to lose their power. What emerges instead is a strange restlessness, sometimes even a sense of emptiness. This is the so-called midlife crisis that modern culture often laughs about, but Jung took it with utmost seriousness. To him, this crisis was not a breakdown but a calling, a signal that the second half of life requires a new orientation, a deeper and more honest relationship with the self. It is here, in this turning, that life as an authentic journey truly begins. When I think about this, I imagine speaking to my younger self, the version of me in his 20s and 30s who thought the world was something to conquer rather than to understand. I would tell him, the storms of youth are necessary, but do not mistake them for the whole ocean. Life is not merely about climbing ladders or chasing dreams. Those pursuits will teach you lessons, but the meaning you seek will not be found there. It waits in the quieter, often overlooked places, in reflection, in self-acceptance, in coming to terms with the shadows you once tried to outrun. Jung believed that by the age of 40, the unconscious begins to press forward with greater urgency. The parts of ourselves we neglected, our fears, our vulnerabilities, our unrealized potential, demand to be heard. If we ignore them, they return as symptoms, dissatisfaction, anxiety, a sense that no achievement quite satisfies. But if we listen, something extraordinary can happen. The second half of life becomes a time of integration, where we begin to reconcile who we pretended to be with who we truly are. This, I think, is the essence of Jung's advice. The midpoint of life is not a decline but a chance for rebirth. It is the moment when we can finally turn away from the masks we wore and begin to live without disguise. To my younger self, I would say, do not fear aging. Do not cling desperately to the fire of youth. For what comes after is not less but more. The fire changes form, it becomes steadier, warmer, able to illuminate the depths of the soul rather than just the surface of the world. Philosophy often reminds us that life is a series of seasons, each with its own necessity. To be young is to sow, to scatter seeds into the soil of possibility. But to reach midlife is to harvest. And the harvest is not material wealth or status. It is wisdom. It is the ability to finally live in alignment with your deeper nature, to recognize that success is not how the world measures you, but how truly you embody your own essence. When Jung said that life begins at 40, he was speaking from the heart of his psychology. He saw that many of his patients who approached that age were not suffering from external problems alone. They were suffering from a deeper hunger of the soul. They had lived in service of what he called the persona, the mask worn for society. But once the mask began to crack, there was an opportunity. Beneath the fragments, a raw face waited to be seen. And so, the advice I would give my younger self is this: do not live so frantically that you forget there will be a second chapter. Do not mistake the urgency of youth for permanence. The work you do now, every mistake, every triumph, every disappointment, is research. And when the time comes, when you reach that midpoint, you will not be starting over. You will finally be ready to begin. The strange thing about youth is that it convinces you of permanence. In your 20s, you think the energy will last forever, that opportunities are endless, and that every mistake can be undone by sheer willpower. In your 30s, you may even believe you are still at the beginning, still proving something to the world, still running on the momentum. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift takes place. The body begins to whisper its limits. Relationships reveal their patterns. Achievements that once felt like peaks begin to feel strangely hollow. Carl Jung described this turning point as the natural curve of life. Just as the sun climbs until noon and then begins its descent, the human soul moves from expansion to contraction, from seeking outward to turning inward. The first half of life is about establishing ourselves. The second half, if we are brave, is about understanding ourselves. And it is here, at the threshold of 40, that we are given the most important choice: to cling to the illusions of youth or to step into the unknown territory of genuine maturity. When I think of my younger self, I remember the restlessness, the desire to impress, to stand out, to grasp at everything that glittered. I realize now that I would tell him something very different, than what he wanted to hear. I would tell him that the real treasures of life are not found in constant striving. They are discovered in depth, not breadth. 1,000 shallow experiences cannot equal the richness of one moment lived fully, without disguise. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole. It is not about becoming perfect, nor about living up to the ideals of others. It is about drawing together the fragments of who you are, the strengths you claim proudly and the weaknesses you try to bury, and weaving them into something true. The midlife years are when this task presses upon us most urgently because the old strategies no longer work. You cannot forever live only by ambition, by youth's hunger for achievement. At some point, the deeper self demands to be recognized. But this recognition is not easy. It asks us to face the shadow, the parts of ourselves we denied, repressed, or projected onto others. In youth, the shadow is easy to avoid. There is always another distraction, another goal, another relationship to chase. By 40, those distractions lose their force. The shadow stands at the door and waits. If you ignore it, you carry the weight of emptiness. If you face it, you step into a new kind of freedom. To my younger self, I would say, do not fear this confrontation. Do not waste years running from what you already carry inside. Every disappointment, every insecurity, every secret resentment, they are not there to destroy you. They are guides pointing toward the parts of you that need to be made whole. What you resist will remain your enemy. What you embrace will become your strength. This is why Jung considered the midlife crisis not a curse but an initiation. It is the initiation into the second half of life, a stage not defined by youthful conquest but by soulful depth. If you accept the invitation, the rewards are profound, a peace that is not dependent on external validation, a sense of purpose that does not fade when the applause dies down, and a relationship with yourself that is rooted in honesty rather than illusion. So if I could send a message back across time, I would whisper to my younger self, do not be afraid of what is coming. Do not cling to the fading light of youth, as if it were the only fire you will ever know. A brighter, steadier light waits for you, one that does not burn wildly but warms everything it touches. Life does not end at 40. It begins. Because only then are you strong enough, humble enough, and wise enough to finally live it as your own. There is a paradox in midlife that Jung understood with unusual clarity. The very things that once gave you strength can begin to hold you back. The drive to succeed, the discipline to push through, the desire to win admiration, these qualities are powerful in youth. But if clung to too tightly, they become chains. What carried you forward in the first half of life can quietly imprison you in the second. To my younger self, I would say this: learn to loosen your grip. You believe now that control is the answer, that if you plan carefully enough, work hard enough, and prove yourself often enough, the world will finally reward you with lasting security. But life will not bend to control. It will bend only to presence, to awareness, to the willingness to meet reality as it is rather than as you demand it to be. Jung saw that the second half of life requires a kind of surrender, but not the surrender of defeat. It is the surrender of illusion, the illusion that we can forever stay young, the illusion that our worth lies in the roles we play, the illusion that happiness is always just one more achievement away. When those illusions dissolve, what remains is not emptiness but truth. And truth, though it may frighten us at first, is the ground on which real freedom is built. This is why many people experience restlessness at midlife. They sense that the ladder they have been climbing is leaning against the wrong wall. They have reached heights they once dreamed of, only to find that the view is not what they hoped. Jung would remind us that this is not failure. It is awakening. It is the signal that it is time to descend, to find a new path, and to walk it with the wisdom of all you have already endured. I imagine speaking to my younger self in one of those sleepless nights, when the mind races with ambition and fear, calculating every move as if life were a chessboard. I would tell him, the game you are playing now matters less than you think. What matters more is the kind of person you are becoming while you play it. One day, the pieces will scatter, the board will be cleared, and none of the victories will mean as much as the character you built in the process. Do not be so consumed with winning that you forget how to live. At 40, life asks you to redefine victory. No longer is it measured in applause or wealth or recognition. Victory becomes the ability to sit with yourself in silence and feel at peace. Victory is the strength to love others without needing to possess them. Victory is the courage to forgive the past and to walk into the unknown with open hands rather than clenched fists. This is the gift of the second half of life. It teaches you that wholeness matters more than achievement, that depth matters more than speed, and that authenticity matters more than approval. It teaches you that aging is not the slow erosion of meaning, but the discovery of a deeper meaning than youth could ever imagine. And so, to my younger self I would say, stop rushing. Stop fearing that you are running out of time. You are not running out, you are preparing. Everything you are living through now is material for the person you are becoming. And when the day comes that you turn 40, you will not be stepping into decline. You will be stepping into truth. What makes the midlife passage so powerful is that it strips away illusions we thought were permanent. In youth, we believe we are defined by our job, our accomplishments, and the way others see us. But around 40, life begins to dismantle that mask piece by piece. It is not cruelty, it is mercy. Because without this stripping away, we would never meet the person we truly are. Jung understood this process as the path toward individuation, the slow and often painful alignment of the inner self with the outer life. Until midlife, most people live in service of what he called the persona, the carefully polished face we show to the world. But the persona is not the whole truth. It is a survival strategy, a role, a necessary mask. At some point, the soul can no longer tolerate the distance between who we are inside and who we pretend to be outside. That distance becomes suffering. It becomes the quiet despair of feeling that no achievement is enough, that no recognition fills the emptiness. And so, the work of midlife is integration, to gather the broken, neglected, and unwanted parts and finally welcome them home. This is why Jung often spoke of the shadow with such seriousness. The shadow is not a monster lurking in the dark, it is the part of you that has been exiled, waiting for acceptance. Only when you have the courage to embrace it can you step into the second half of life with authenticity. If I were speaking to my younger self, I would tell him, do not be afraid of imperfection. Do not waste energy trying to appear flawless. You will never win that battle, and even if you did, the victory would be hollow. What matters is not perfection but wholeness. To be whole is to hold together the light and the dark, the triumphs and the failures, the strength and the fragility. To be whole is to no longer hide from yourself. This is the wisdom that comes only with time. Youth wants to shine, maturity wants to endure. Youth wants applause, maturity wants truth. Youth wants to conquer the world, maturity wants to reconcile with the soul. By 40, if you are willing to listen, you realize that the race you were running was never against others. It was always a race toward yourself. There is a gentleness that can arise in this stage of life, a compassion for yourself and for others. You begin to see that everyone is carrying wounds, that everyone is wrestling with shadows. Instead of judging, you understand. Instead of competing, you connect. This is one of the quiet miracles of midlife. The heart grows softer even as the mind grows sharper. You become less interested in proving and more interested in being. To my younger self, I would say, do not fear the coming of years. Do not see 40 as an ending, but as an opening. It is the moment when life invites you to stop performing and start living. It is the moment when you can finally breathe, no longer chasing every horizon, but standing firmly on the ground of your own being. That is where freedom begins, not in endless striving, but in simple truth. When Carl Jung said that life begins at 40, he was not promising ease. He was pointing toward a threshold. To cross it requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to face everything you once turned away from. But if you can walk through it, what you find on the other side is not decline, not loss, but a new beginning, one richer, deeper, and far more human than anything that came before. I would tell my younger self that the first half of life is necessary. The struggles, the mistakes, the chasing after recognition, all of it is part of the research, as Jung called it. Those years are the training ground, the preparation, the shaping of raw material. But you must understand, They are not the whole story. They are the prologue. And if you cling to them as if they were the entire book, you will miss the chapters that matter most. By 40, you begin to see that life is not about accumulation. It is about distillation. You no longer need to prove yourself endlessly to others. What you need is to gather the essence of your experience and live it with clarity. Every scar becomes a lesson, every failure becomes a teacher, every shadow becomes a guide. This is what Jung meant when he said the second half of life is about individuation, the slow, patient work of becoming the person you were meant to be all along. The advice I would give my younger self is this: learn to listen earlier. Listen to the silence between your thoughts. Listen to the body when it tells you to rest. Listen to the heart when it longs for authenticity over applause. Do not drown these signals in noise, distraction, or ambition. They are the compass that will guide you when the outward map no longer makes sense. Another truth that midlife reveals is that time is finite. Youth moves as if life will last forever. But 40 brings a quiet recognition: the road ahead is shorter than the road already traveled. Some people fear this. They see only limitation. But Jung believed it was the beginning of real freedom. Because when you realize that time is finite, you finally stop wasting it. You stop living for the approval of others. You stop chasing every empty promise. You begin to ask what truly matters, and you begin to live with urgency, not for achievement, but for meaning. This awareness of mortality is not a curse, it is a gift. It sharpens life, like a sculptor chiseling away what is unnecessary. At 40, you realize that every day is too precious to be lived in pretense. You cannot afford to keep wearing masks. You cannot afford to ignore the voice of your soul. And so, the second half of life becomes the time not for expansion outward, but for descent inward, into truth, into wisdom, into love. I would tell my younger self, do not mistake this descent for decline. Our culture teaches us to fear aging, to cling desperately to youth as if it were the only stage of life worth having. But this is blindness. The second half of life is not about losing vitality, it is about gaining depth. You may not run as fast, but you will see more clearly. You may not be as restless, but you will be more grounded. The fire of youth is bright and wild, but the fire of maturity is steady and enduring. And in the end, it is the steady fire that warms the soul. There is also a deeper compassion that awakens here. You begin to forgive yourself for the mistakes of youth. You begin to forgive others too, because you finally see how fragile and conflicted everyone truly is. The harsh judgments of youth give way to understanding. You see that we are all struggling, all carrying shadows, all searching for meaning. And in that recognition, you learn to love more fully, not in the desperate, consuming way of youth, but in a way that allows freedom, for yourself and for others. And perhaps this is the greatest secret that Jung offers us about midlife: it is not about becoming someone new. It is about finally becoming yourself. It is about dropping the roles, the performances, the borrowed identities, and standing with the quiet dignity of authenticity. This is where peace is found. Not in constant striving, but in arriving at your own life, after years of wandering. So if I could send one final message back to my younger self, it would be this: be patient. Do not fear the years to come. Do not believe the lie that life peaks in youth. Life ripens. Life deepens. Life becomes real only when you are ready to live it without disguise. Everything you are rushing through now is preparing you for that moment. When you reach it, do not resist. Step into it with courage. Because that is when life begins, not at the frantic height of ambition, but at the quiet center of truth. That is when you will know that your story was never about climbing higher and higher, but about returning to yourself, whole and unbroken. That is the gift of midlife. That is the beginning Jung was speaking of. And when you stand there, no longer afraid of time, no longer at war with yourself, you will understand that nothing was wasted. Every struggle, every detour, every mask you once wore, they were all part of the path that led you here. The path to becoming yourself. The path to life's true beginning. Carl Jung spent much of his life listening to what most people never dared to say out loud. He sat in silence while patients revealed the hidden corners of their minds, those shadowed places where fear, envy, hatred, and longing twisted together. He came to believe that what was truly dangerous in a person was not simply the mistakes they made or the anger they carried, but something far more subtle, the refusal to recognize what lives inside themselves. For Jung, the most dangerous sign in a person was when they became blind to their own darkness. Jung called this darkness the shadow, not because it was evil by nature, but because it was hidden. Every human being carries it. It is composed of the impulses we deny, the emotions we repress, and the truths we fear to admit even to ourselves. Left unacknowledged, this shadow grows restless. It leaks into our lives through cruelty disguised as justice, jealousy disguised as moral outrage, or hatred disguised as virtue. Jung saw it in the world around him, in the wars and political movements of the 20th century, but also in the everyday cruelty between neighbors, lovers, and families. The person who insists that they have no shadow, who clings desperately to the mask of goodness or superiority, this is where danger begins. For such a person believes they are pure, that their intentions are beyond reproach. And yet, their unexamined shadow does not vanish. It moves beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to seize control. Jung observed that entire societies could fall under the spell of such blindness, when leaders projected their own hidden rage onto enemies, or when ordinary citizens turned against scapegoats rather than confronting their own complicity. To stay alert, Jung suggested, we must learn to see the signs of this blindness. A dangerous person is often one who cannot admit fault, who reacts with hostility when confronted, who must always believe that the evil lies somewhere else, in another person, another group, another nation. This inability to look inward is what transforms ordinary flaws into something destructive. For Jung, the problem was not that people had darkness, but that they refused to meet it face to face. Jung himself was not immune. He confessed that his own dreams revealed cruel and violent impulses, and he insisted that to pretend otherwise would be a lie. He believed that honesty about the shadow was not a weakness but a strength, a form of humility that kept the destructive side of the psyche in check. In his writings, he often described the figures of mythology and religion, tricksters, demons, tempters, not as alien beings, but as symbols of the very forces that stir within each of us. The dangerous sign, then, was not the presence of such forces, but the denial of them. When someone speaks with too much certainty about their own virtue, when they declare themselves free of envy, anger, or desire, Jung would remind us to listen carefully. What they have buried does not simply disappear. It waits, it festers, and in moments of crisis it can erupt with shocking violence. To Jung, the person who claims to be without a shadow is like a house with locked rooms, silent, dark, and filled with things the owner refuses to touch. It is not the house itself that is dangerous, but what may break loose when the doors can no longer hold. Jung often warned that the greatest danger does not come from an enemy outside us, but from what lies unacknowledged within. He had seen too many men and women who tried to run from their own inner life, who built a mask so convincing that they themselves began to believe in it. This mask, which Jung called the persona, was useful in society. It allowed people to play roles, to meet expectations, to function within families and workplaces. But when the mask grew too rigid, when a person became identified with it completely, it hid the shadow so deeply that they forgot it was even there. This forgetting was not harmless. A man who imagines himself incapable of cruelty may unconsciously act it out in subtle ways, disguised as righteousness or as discipline. A woman who insists she feels no envy may quietly poison her own relationships, unable to bear the sight of someone else thriving. The mask becomes a shield, and the more tightly someone clings to it, the more their hidden impulses grow restless in the dark. For Jung, this restlessness could eventually erupt in ways that shocked both the person and everyone around them. He observed this dynamic not only in individuals but in entire cultures. The German people of his own time, for instance, were educated, disciplined, and proud of their achievements. Yet beneath the surface of this cultural persona lay unresolved fears, resentments, and collective shadows. When these forces were denied, they were projected outward. What could not be admitted within was instead blamed on scapegoats. Jung understood this as a dangerous sign, one that revealed how denial of the shadow can spread from a single person to an entire nation, until destruction follows on a massive scale. In the life of an individual, the process works the same way, only on a smaller stage. Jung wrote that what a person refuses to face within themselves will be forced upon them from the outside, as if fate itself conspires to make them see what they ignore. The unacknowledged shadow returns in the form of endless conflict, broken friendships, or failures that repeat without explanation. Someone who swears they are not angry may find themselves surrounded by hostile people. Someone who denies their own capacity for betrayal may become the victim of it again and again. What is not brought to light from within comes to meet us from without. The dangerous sign, then, is not loud or obvious at first. It is subtle, quiet, a kind of rigidity in the way a person presents themselves. They become too certain of their own goodness, too defensive when confronted, too unwilling to consider that their flaws may live in the very places they deny. This defensiveness is not strength but fragility, a brittle wall that must be protected at all costs. Jung believed that when this wall finally cracks, what pours through can be devastating, because it has been gathering force for years in silence. For Jung, the path of wisdom was not to destroy the shadow but to learn to live with it. To say, yes, I carry anger, envy, pride, cruelty, but I will not let these things rule me. The shadow is part of what makes us human. To imagine that we can be entirely rid of it is an illusion, and it is that illusion which makes a person truly dangerous. What cannot be admitted cannot be managed. What cannot be managed eventually bursts free. And when it does, it can sweep away not only the person themselves but those who stand near them. Jung often turned to myths and ancient stories to explain why the shadow must be faced. He believed that our ancestors told these tales not only to entertain but to remind us of truths that never change. In many legends, the hero does not find strength by avoiding the monster, but by confronting it directly. The monster is terrifying because it mirrors what lives inside the hero himself. To run from it is to remain weak. To face it is to discover hidden power. Jung saw this pattern not as fantasy but as a psychological law. What we fear most in ourselves is also where our greatest potential lies. He wrote that the shadow contains not only destructive impulses but also vitality, creativity, and energy that have been suppressed. A person who denies their aggression may also cut themselves off from courage. Someone who hides their selfishness may also lose the ability to pursue their own dreams. In trying to appear pure, they become shallow, brittle, and disconnected from life. Jung warned that this hollowness is another dangerous sign, for it shows that the person has sacrificed authenticity for the safety of the mask. What is left behind is not wholeness but emptiness. In his work with patients, Jung often saw how transformative it could be when someone finally admitted their shadow. A man who had lived his whole life denying his anger would break down and confess it, and in doing so he became less cruel, not more. A woman who admitted her envy found herself more capable of kindness, not less. By allowing the shadow into awareness, they robbed it of its hidden power. It no longer needed to erupt unconsciously, because it had been given a voice in the light of day. This, Jung believed, was the path to maturity. The danger was not in having a shadow, but in being possessed by it without knowing. Jung compared this to being overtaken by an unseen force. People who insist they are incapable of darkness are the ones most likely to act it out unconsciously. They may suddenly turn vindictive, destructive, or violent, and afterward they will swear that it was not truly them, that it came from nowhere. But in truth it came from the locked rooms of their own psyche, rooms they refused to open. The eruption feels alien because they never claimed those parts as their own. For Jung, the individual who could acknowledge their flaws, their envy, their selfishness, their aggression, was far less dangerous than the one who denied all of it. The honest man who admits his shadow can work with it, guide it, and keep it in check. But the man who swears he has no darkness at all is like a blind driver racing down a crowded street. He believes he sees clearly, but in reality he has no idea what forces steer his hand. It is not his virtue that makes him safe, but his blindness that makes him perilous. Jung warned that modern society made this blindness worse. He saw how industrial culture demanded people present themselves as efficient, polite, and rational, leaving no space for raw emotions. This constant performance pushed the shadow deeper underground. People became so concerned with how they appeared that they forgot who they were. And when the mask was finally stripped away, what emerged was often shocking, because it carried the weight of years of repression. Jung believed that one of the clearest signs of danger in a person was projection. Projection happens when someone takes the qualities they cannot admit in themselves and sees them only in others. A man who denies his own dishonesty will become obsessed with finding liars everywhere he looks. A woman who hides her own aggression may call everyone else violent and cruel. In doing this, the person protects their fragile mask, but at the cost of warping the way they see the world. Jung warned that projection makes a person blind not only to themselves but to reality itself. This blindness is not harmless. When an individual cannot admit to their own envy or cruelty, they place it on others and begin to treat them as enemies. Families break apart because one member cannot see that the faults they accuse others of are their own. Nations fall into conflict because leaders project their hidden rage onto outsiders. Jung saw this during the rise of fascism, where collective shadows were projected onto minorities, creating a cycle of fear and destruction. What was denied within was hunted without, and the result was catastrophe. In everyday life, projection reveals itself in smaller but still destructive ways. The friend who accuses everyone else of betrayal may be hiding their own unfaithfulness. The colleague who cannot stop calling others lazy may secretly fear their own lack of discipline. These patterns are so common that they often go unnoticed, but Jung considered them one of the most important signals of the shadow at work. A person who projects constantly, who cannot reflect on their own part in conflict, who always believes the darkness lies elsewhere, carries within them the most dangerous sign of all. Jung insisted that facing the shadow requires humility. It means pausing before condemning another, and asking if the same flaw might live in oneself. This act of reflection is not comfortable. It demands honesty that can feel unbearable at first. Yet without it, a person becomes increasingly dangerous, because they live in a world distorted by their own denials. Every enemy they see is partly themselves. Every flaw they condemn is a reflection of what they refuse to acknowledge. In this way, the unexamined shadow not only destroys relationships but also corrodes the mind from within. For Jung, the most dangerous sign was not rage itself, or envy, or cruelty. It was certainty without reflection, the inability to doubt one's own innocence. This kind of person becomes a prisoner of their own mask, unable to see the human complexity in themselves or in others. And when life inevitably forces the shadow to the surface, when events strip away the carefully built facade, what emerges is raw and untamed. Jung believed that tragedies often begin with people who could not bear to look in the mirror and see their whole self. He reminded us that light cannot exist without darkness, and the psyche cannot be whole without the shadow. To deny this truth is to build a fragile tower that cannot stand. When such a tower collapses, it falls not only on the one who built it but on everyone nearby. That is why Jung urged constant vigilance, not against others alone, but against the signs of blindness within ourselves. For the person who refuses this inner work does not only carry danger for themselves, but becomes a danger to all around them. Jung often said that the task of a lifetime is the making of the self. He called this process individuation, and he believed it could never be achieved without facing the shadow. The shadow is not simply a burden to be carried, but the doorway to wholeness. Yet most people run from it all their lives. They hide behind masks, they project onto others, they build fragile towers of purity, and in doing so, they cut themselves off from their own depth. The most dangerous sign in a person, Jung believed, is when this running hardens into certainty. When someone insists that they are only good, that all evil belongs to others, that they themselves are above envy, anger, or greed, the danger has already begun. For such a person is no longer in contact with reality. They have split themselves into fragments, clinging only to what seems acceptable and throwing the rest into darkness. The more they deny, the more power those hidden forces gain. Jung warned that sooner or later, what is denied will return. The shadow waits patiently. It may return in sudden bursts of rage that shock even the one who lashes out. It may return in patterns of destruction, repeated mistakes that seem to come from nowhere. It may return in illness, in depression, in dreams that disturb sleep and refuse to be silenced. And if it is never faced, it can return on a collective scale, sweeping through entire groups of people who all share the same blindness, binding them together in fear, hatred, and violence. Yet Jung was not a pessimist. He did not believe the shadow was simply evil. He believed it was part of the soul's natural structure. Just as night belongs to day, so does shadow belong to light. He wrote that those who dare to meet their own darkness do not become worse, but better. They become deeper, more grounded, more human. They discover that what they feared in themselves was not only destructive impulse, but also passion, courage, creativity, and vitality. The same fire that burns can also give warmth. To stay alert, then, is not only to watch others, but to watch ourselves. The dangerous sign is not only out there, in the people we distrust, but within us whenever we deny what is ours to carry. Each time we say to ourselves, I could never be cruel, I could never be selfish, I could never betray, we should pause. For in that certainty, the seed of danger is already planted. The shadow asks to be acknowledged, not to be denied. It asks us to look with clear eyes and say, yes, these things live in me, but I will not let them control me. Jung believed that this act of acknowledgement is the beginning of wisdom. A wise person is not one who is free of darkness, but one who knows where their darkness lies and refuses to let it rule unchecked. They do not need to project it onto others, because they have claimed it as part of themselves. They do not need to wear a rigid mask, because they are not afraid to admit that they are flawed. And because they are honest with themselves, they can be honest with others. He once wrote that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This was not meant as despair, but as guidance. To grow into our highest self, we must also descend into what is lowest. To become whole, we must gather not only the light but also the shadow. The person who refuses this descent, who pretends their roots are pure and spotless, builds a life that cannot withstand the storms of reality. Their roots are shallow, and when the wind comes, they fall. This fall is the collapse of the mask, the eruption of the denied shadow, and it is often most destructive when it is least expected. The dangerous sign, then, is the absence of humility. It is the refusal to say, I too am capable of what I despise. It is the insistence that the darkness belongs only to others. And it is this blindness that Jung saw again and again as the seed of tragedy, whether in personal lives torn apart by unacknowledged impulses, or in nations consumed by their own collective shadow. But there is another path. Jung's work was not only a warning, but also a call to courage. To live fully is to risk looking into the depths of one's own soul. It is to open the locked rooms of the house and see what has been hidden there. It is to admit envy, to confess anger, to recognize cruelty, and then to choose differently, not by denial but by awareness. This path does not erase danger, but it transforms it. The person who faces their shadow carries it consciously, and because they know its weight, they are less likely to throw it on others. In this sense, Jung saw individuation not only as a personal journey, but as an ethical responsibility. To know one's own darkness is to prevent it from spilling into the world unchecked. The one who admits their capacity for cruelty is less likely to act it out. The one who confesses their envy is less likely to sabotage others. The one who accepts their selfishness is more able to balance it with generosity. The shadow does not vanish, but it no longer rules in secret. So when Jung spoke of the most dangerous sign in a person, he was pointing to a blindness of the soul, a refusal to see what is already there. It is not the darkness itself that destroys, but the denial of it. And he believed that the work of every human being is to stay alert to that denial, in themselves as much as in others. For only by facing what is hidden can one walk the path toward wholeness, and only by walking that path can we hope to live with depth, humility, and true strength. Loneliness has become one of the defining experiences of our age. We live in crowded cities, we scroll endlessly through oceans of faces on glowing screens, we carry devices that connect us to millions of people at any second, yet inside, there is a silence that feels unbearable. It is a silence that even conversation cannot fully break, a distance that even intimacy sometimes cannot cross. And it is precisely this paradox that Carl Jung understood long before our world was filled with smartphones and social networks. That loneliness is not the absence of people, but the absence of connection to one's own soul. Jung wrote that the greatest burden a person must bear is to live a life that is not truly theirs. This, he believed, is the root of the loneliness that haunts us. Surrounded by others, we may wear the masks expected of us, being agreeable, successful, entertaining, useful. But beneath these masks, if we have never discovered who we really are, every encounter feels hollow. We can be in a room filled with laughter and still feel a weight pressing on our chest, because the laughter is not ours, not born from the place of truth inside us. Jung called this inner truth the self, the deeper center of being that the ego constantly avoids. What makes his insight timeless is that it speaks to the very condition of modern life. We have achieved what earlier generations could barely imagine, a world in which we are never truly alone. At any moment, we can check in with others, share our thoughts instantly, seek validation with a tap of a screen. Yet Jung would say that the more we rush to avoid solitude, the more it stalks us. Because in trying to escape the inner emptiness, we only tighten its grip. For Jung, the individual who cannot sit with their own company is condemned to wander restlessly, always in search of an external cure for an internal wound. To understand this, Jung drew from his patients, from myth, from his own struggles. He once confessed that his loneliest hours were not when he lacked company, but when he was forced to confront the vastness of his own unconscious. He described it as standing on the shore of a dark sea, knowing that beneath its surface were forces larger than anything he could control. It was in these moments that he realized the truth. Loneliness is not defeated by the crowd, it is transformed only by dialogue with the depths of the psyche. This is why Jung gave such importance to dreams, to symbols, to the images that arise when we stop running from ourselves. He saw them as messages from the unconscious, attempts of the self to reach the ego, and reminded of what has been forgotten. When we ignore these messages, we become estranged from our own inner life, and that estrangement is what no amount of external companionship can cure. People may sit beside us, hold us, even love us, but if we remain cut off from the river of meaning within, their presence cannot quench the thirst. He often warned of what he called the cult of adaptation, the pressure to adjust ourselves endlessly to the expectations of society. The more we adapt, the more successful we might appear, but the more the soul withers in silence. And when the soul grows silent, loneliness appears like a shadow, whispering that something essential is missing. This is why so many today, despite wealth or fame or a calendar filled with meetings, still speak of a strange emptiness at the core of their lives. Jung would say that emptiness is not a flaw, but a signal, an urgent message that the self is waiting to be found. For him, the cure was not in retreating from society altogether, nor in drowning ourselves in endless interaction. It was in the quiet and often painful work of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of reconciling the conscious self with the unconscious depths. Individuation, Jung insisted, is not a luxury. It is the only way to live without the constant ache of loneliness. Because once the inner world is reconciled, even solitude becomes rich, and even company becomes meaningful. In this light, the modern epidemic of loneliness is not simply a social problem. It is a spiritual problem, a failure of the inner dialogue. We keep adding more voices from the outside, hoping they will fill the silence inside, but Jung reminds us that until we listen inward, the silence will remain. To feel truly at home in the world, one must first feel at home in the depths of the psyche. And perhaps that is the most comforting message hidden in his thought, that loneliness is not a life sentence, but a doorway. It is the signal that we have strayed too far from our center, and that the path forward is not outward but inward, into the vast, untamed forest of the soul. It is there, Jung believed, that we will discover that the loneliness haunting us is not an enemy, but a guide. Loneliness, Jung believed, is not a mistake in the human experience, but an unavoidable threshold that every soul must cross. When we feel it rising inside us, when even familiar faces seem distant, it is not proof that life has failed us. It is proof that life is asking us to pay attention. To Jung, the ache of loneliness was a summons from the unconscious, a demand that the individual step beyond the shallow roles of society and encounter the depths of their own being. He understood that most people are terrified of this call. We busy ourselves with noise, with schedules, with endless streams of distraction, because to sit in silence is to face what we have buried. The modern world, with its constant connectivity, makes this easier than ever. We can lose ourselves in the chatter of others, in the lives flashing across our screens, in the illusion of closeness without intimacy. Yet Jung would say that such closeness is fragile. It collapses in moments of crisis, and then the loneliness returns with even greater force, reminding us that it had never truly left. What makes Jung's insight so profound is that he did not see loneliness as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. To him, it was a sign that the ego and the self were divided. The ego, our everyday identity, strives for approval, status, and belonging. But the self, that deeper wholeness of the psyche, demands authenticity, integration, and truth. When these two are at odds, a person feels torn from the inside. Surrounded by people, one still feels unseen, because the truest parts of the soul are not allowed into the light. Jung often wrote about what he called the shadow, the collection of traits and desires that we repress because they do not fit the image we wish to show the world. These shadow elements do not disappear simply because we push them away. They continue to live inside us, growing restless, shaping our moods, and deepening our sense of isolation. For the person who never turns inward, loneliness is magnified by this hidden war within the psyche. It is not just that others do not understand us. It is that we do not understand ourselves. This is why Jung urged people to embrace the work of self-exploration. He encouraged them to write down their dreams, to paint the images that rose from their imagination, to sit with their emotions rather than flee from them. Such practices were not hobbies. They were acts of reconciliation, attempts to bring the hidden parts of the self back into conversation with the conscious mind. And in doing so, loneliness could shift. It could transform from an unbearable emptiness into a creative tension, a space in which something new could emerge. In his own life, Jung faced periods of profound solitude. After his break with Freud, he entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a time when he withdrew from many of his professional duties and immersed himself in the strange visions and fantasies that filled his mind. From the outside, it might have looked like madness, or at least isolation. Yet for Jung, this period was the foundation of his later philosophy. He discovered that when one enters deeply into solitude, the psyche responds. Images arise, symbols appear, and the loneliness begins to speak in its own language. It is no longer a silent void, but a dialogue with the depths. This idea changes how we see our own loneliness today. Instead of treating it as a flaw to be erased, we might see it as a companion pointing toward what is missing. If we listen carefully, it tells us which parts of ourselves have been abandoned. Perhaps it reminds us of a creativity long suppressed, or a longing for meaning buried beneath the duties of survival. Perhaps it speaks of grief we never allowed ourselves to feel, or of love we have denied ourselves in order to appear strong. Loneliness is not only pain, it is also memory. It remembers the parts of us that remain unmet. And so Jung did not tell people to escape loneliness by drowning themselves in the crowd. He urged them to make solitude conscious, to engage with it deliberately. In doing so, they could discover that the world within them was not barren but fertile, alive with possibilities that had been waiting to be noticed. Only from this place of inner dialogue could a person truly step back into the outer world and feel at home among others. Because then, connection would not be driven by need or desperation, but by wholeness. It is a demanding path, but Jung believed it was the only path that led to true community. For without inner reconciliation, every relationship remains haunted by the unspoken, by the unresolved, by the loneliness we carry in secret. To find ourselves is therefore the first act of love. Only then does the company of others cease to be a distraction from loneliness and become a deep sharing of life. Jung believed that loneliness, when endured with patience, becomes the soil out of which creativity and meaning can grow. It is not a comfortable soil. It feels barren, desolate, even hostile. Yet it is within that inner desert that the psyche begins to speak in symbols, offering images and ideas that can only arise in silence. Many of the world's greatest works of art, literature, and philosophy, Jung observed, were born not from contentment but from the profound solitude of those who dared to face their own depths. For Jung, the unconscious was not just a storehouse of forgotten memories. It was a living wellspring of imagination, endlessly producing forms, stories, and visions that sought expression. When a person withdraws from the noise of the crowd and enters solitude, they begin to hear the voice of this inner world. At first it may sound chaotic or frightening. Dreams may disturb, fantasies may unsettle, emotions may rise without warning. But Jung insisted that within this apparent chaos lies order, within the strangeness lies guidance. The psyche, he believed, is always moving toward wholeness, and it uses loneliness to push us inward so that we might receive the images that can heal and transform us. He himself embodied this process. During the years after his split with Freud, when he endured what seemed to be overwhelming isolation, Jung began to paint, to write, to let the strange figures of his inner world come forth onto paper. What resulted was the Red Book, a vast collection of visions, dialogues, and symbolic images that would remain hidden for decades but which he considered the foundation of his later psychology. Out of loneliness came creation. Out of solitude came meaning. He did not escape the emptiness by seeking distraction, but by listening until the emptiness began to speak. This insight reveals why so many people today feel both restless and unfulfilled. In our culture, loneliness is seen only as a problem to be eliminated. We are taught to chase stimulation, to fill every gap with entertainment or company, to silence the inner voice before it can unsettle us. But Jung saw this as a tragic mistake. For it is precisely when we fall into silence, when the masks fall away, that we encounter the raw material of creativity. The artist, the thinker, the visionary, all are shaped not by avoiding loneliness but by dwelling in it long enough to hear what it has to say. And this is not limited to art. Jung believed that every human being, whether or not they consider themselves creative, is called to shape meaning from their inner life. The dreams, symbols, and feelings that arise in solitude are not accidents, they are invitations. They point to paths we might take, values we might reclaim, aspects of ourselves we might integrate. To ignore them is to remain trapped in a shallow existence, always surrounded yet always unsatisfied. To listen to them is to begin the process of individuation, the journey of becoming whole. There is, however, a danger in this process, and Jung knew it well. Too much isolation without guidance can overwhelm a person. The unconscious is powerful, and if its images are not balanced with consciousness, one can be swept away. This is why he stressed the importance of bringing inner experiences into some form, writing them, painting them, shaping them into ritual or story, so that they become bridges rather than floods. In this way, loneliness is not an abyss but a workshop, where raw emotion is transformed into something that can be shared. And here lies a paradox that Jung illuminated. True connection with others can only emerge from this inner work. When we create from the depths of our solitude, we produce something that resonates universally, something others recognize as their own hidden truth. The writer who reveals their private despair gives voice to countless others. The painter who dares to depict the shadows of the soul allows others to see their own darkness reflected. Out of loneliness comes the possibility of communion, not the shallow communion of surface chatter, but the profound communion of shared meaning. Thus, loneliness is not simply an obstacle to be overcome. It is a threshold to be crossed. It asks us to suffer its silence long enough to find what lies beneath. And when we do, what once felt like a wound begins to feel like a source. The loneliness that seemed unbearable becomes the very place from which life flows again. For Jung, loneliness was never only a psychological issue. It was also a spiritual calling. Beneath the ache of isolation, he sensed the human longing for connection with something greater than the personal self, something vast, timeless, and eternal. He believed that every soul carries within it an innate orientation toward the sacred, and that the pain of loneliness often arises when this connection is broken or ignored. In this sense, the loneliness of modern man was not merely social disconnection. It was the hunger for transcendence in a world that had forgotten how to honor it. Jung often wrote that modern people suffered from what he called a loss of soul. By this he meant that in the pursuit of progress, technology, and external achievement, the inner world had been neglected, and with it the sense of belonging to a larger order of existence. Religion, once a source of shared symbols and meaning, had lost much of its authority in the West. But in discarding it, many individuals were left stranded, no longer held by myths or rituals that could anchor the psyche in a cosmos of meaning. What replaced it was a culture of materialism and shallow diversions. And in this culture, Jung observed, loneliness grew like a hidden epidemic. He was not calling for a return to dogma or to unthinking belief. Instead, he urged people to rediscover the symbolic life. He believed that the unconscious continually produces images that point beyond the ego to the realm of the sacred. Dreams filled with archetypal figures, visions of light and shadow, even the sense of awe one feels in the presence of nature, all of these were, to Jung, signs of the psyche reaching toward the divine. If a person could learn to read these symbols, loneliness could transform into a spiritual dialogue. One would no longer feel abandoned in a meaningless universe, but rather addressed by it, spoken to by something greater. This is why Jung said that the individual who has no contact with the unconscious is cut off from the source of life itself. Without this contact, people drift, endlessly seeking fulfillment in others yet never finding it. But with it, even solitude becomes filled with presence. One begins to feel accompanied by something larger, whether it is named God, the self, or simply the mystery of existence. In that presence, loneliness softens, because the soul recognizes that it is not truly alone. Jung himself found this in his own encounters with the unconscious. During his visions, he experienced figures that seemed to carry wisdom far beyond his personal mind. He described conversations with inner guides, presences that felt as real to him as any human teacher. He did not insist that these figures were literal beings. What mattered was that they carried meaning, that they revealed dimensions of the psyche connected to the collective experience of humanity. In listening to them, he felt less isolated, for he realized that the depths of his soul were linked to something universal. This is why he argued that loneliness is, at its core, the feeling of being disconnected from the whole. We suffer not because we are physically alone, but because we feel spiritually severed from others, severed from nature, severed from the divine ground of being. To heal loneliness, then, is not simply to add more company. It is to rediscover the invisible bonds that unite us to all life. It is to awaken to the archetypes, the eternal patterns of the psyche, that remind us we are part of a greater story unfolding across generations. Such a vision changes the way one experiences solitude. Instead of emptiness, solitude becomes sacred space. It becomes the temple where the soul can hear its deepest truths. In this space, silence itself becomes meaningful, because it carries the resonance of something eternal. And from this silence, one can return to others with a new kind of presence, not demanding that they fill an inner void, but offering companionship born from a place of inner fullness. Loneliness, then, is not simply a psychological wound but a spiritual doorway. It asks us to step beyond the shallow noise of daily life and to encounter the mystery that surrounds us. To deny it is to remain restless and disconnected. To accept it is to find that even in solitude, we are profoundly accompanied by the depths of our own soul and by the eternal patterns that link us to the whole of existence. To Jung, the pain of loneliness was never meant to be the end of the story. It was the beginning of transformation. He saw it as the summons that pulls us away from shallow existence, away from the endless chase for approval and distraction, and into the deeper work of becoming whole. Every ache of isolation, he believed, is the psyche reminding us that something essential waits to be acknowledged, that the dialogue with the self has fallen silent and must be renewed. What makes his vision so enduring is that it refuses both extremes, the denial of loneliness through constant noise, and the despair that comes from believing it is permanent. Instead, he places loneliness at the very heart of individuation. To enter solitude consciously is to discover that the emptiness conceals a hidden fullness. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes alive with dreams, symbols, and intuitions. The shadow that once frightened us becomes the source of new strength. And the longing that once seemed endless becomes a bridge to something larger, something sacred. Jung never promised that this path would be easy. To face loneliness honestly is to face our own wounds, our own forgotten desires, our own vulnerability. It means admitting that the masks we wear, however polished, do not protect us from the truths buried beneath. But he also knew that no true healing occurs without this confrontation. A life spent avoiding loneliness is a life spent avoiding oneself. And such avoidance, however full of activity, will always feel hollow. The reward of this work is a new way of being in the world. Once the inner dialogue is restored, once the ego and the self are in conversation again, a profound shift occurs. Solitude no longer feels like exile but like home. Other people are no longer sought to fill an emptiness but are met as fellow travelers, each carrying their own depths. Love becomes freer, because it is no longer rooted in desperation. Community becomes richer, because it is no longer built on masks. Even silence between people begins to carry meaning, because it is shared from a place of wholeness. In the end, Jung saw loneliness not as an enemy but as a guide. It is the teacher that strips away illusions, the companion that refuses to be silenced until we turn inward, the threshold that every soul must cross to enter the fullness of its own life. In its grip, we may feel abandoned, but if we listen, we find that it is leading us back to ourselves, back to meaning, back to the mysterious ground of being from which no one is ever truly separate. And so the message is both sobering and comforting. Sobering, because loneliness will touch every life, and there is no escape through distraction alone. Comforting, because within it lies the very key to healing, creativity, and connection. Jung's insight reminds us that the loneliness we feel in a world full of people is not proof that something is wrong with us. It is proof that something deep within us is still alive, still reaching, still calling us toward the wholeness we have yet to claim. To answer that call is to walk a path few choose, but it is also the path that leads from emptiness to meaning, from isolation to belonging, from the ache of separation to the quiet fullness of the soul at peace with itself. Heartbreak is one of the most difficult and transformative experiences a person can face. It is a feeling so intense and personal that it can shake the very core of our being. When someone we love deeply leaves or the connection we cherished fades away, it often feels like our entire world collapses around us. The pain feels unbearable and endless. Our mind races with endless questions and doubts. Why did this happen to me? Was I not enough? Could I have done something differently? These thoughts repeat, making it hard to find peace or clarity. Yet heartbreak is not just about loss. It is about learning about ourselves and life in a way that nothing else can prepare us for. It is a harsh but honest teacher that forces us to confront our vulnerabilities and fears. The ancient philosophers understood this deeply. For example, the Stoics taught that the suffering we feel is not caused by external events themselves, but by the way we judge and interpret those events. When love ends, our minds often create stories of rejection, failure, and unworthiness, but these are not absolute truths. They are interpretations formed from our past wounds, fears, and insecurities. Learning to step back and observe our own thoughts as if from a distance can be a powerful tool. It allows us to see that much of the suffering we endure is amplified by the stories we tell ourselves. If we practice this observation with patience and kindness, we can begin to loosen the grip of those painful narratives and start to experience heartbreak more clearly as what it is: raw emotional pain and loss without the extra layers of judgment and blame. This awareness does not erase the pain or magically heal the wounds, but it changes our relationship with the pain. When we stop fighting or denying our feelings and instead allow ourselves to fully experience them, something profound begins to happen. The heartache becomes less of a burden and more of a passage. It becomes a river we must cross rather than a trap that confines us. Philosophy invites us to embrace the full depth of our emotions, including the sadness, loneliness, and confusion that come with heartbreak. Instead of trying to avoid or suppress these feelings, we are encouraged to sit with them and understand what they reveal about us, about our desires, our fears, and our capacity to love deeply. This process of deep listening to ourselves is not easy. It can be frightening and exhausting, but it is also the path to true healing and growth. In this space of honest feeling, we discover that heartbreak is not a sign of weakness but of courage, the courage it takes to open one's heart to another, to risk vulnerability and trust. Despite the pain, the fact that we dared to love fully is a testament to our humanity and strength. The heart that breaks is a heart that has lived and loved with passion and authenticity. The journey through heartbreak often feels lonely, but it is also a journey back to ourselves. When we lose someone we cared for, it can feel like a piece of us is missing. Yet philosophy teaches that the self is not fixed or dependent on others. It is fluid, resilient, and capable of renewal. Even when we feel shattered, the potential for healing and transformation remains within us like a hidden flame waiting to be kindled. Many philosophical traditions speak of the importance of acceptance and surrender in times of suffering. The idea is not to resign ourselves to pain, but to acknowledge reality without resistance. This acceptance is a powerful form of freedom. It frees us from the endless struggle against what is and allows us to move forward with greater clarity and peace. It is like a traveler who stops fighting against the storm and instead learns to navigate through it with wisdom and grace. In the depths of heartbreak, we can also find unexpected gifts. The experience teaches empathy, as we become more sensitive to the pain of others. It teaches humility, as we realize that suffering is a shared human condition. It teaches patience, as we learn to trust in the slow unfolding of healing rather than demanding quick fixes. This time of emotional upheaval can also be an invitation to reconnect with our deeper values and purpose. When the old relationship ends, it creates space for us to reflect on what we truly want from life and love. It helps us to let go of illusions and face the truth about ourselves and our desires. This clarity can lead to greater authenticity in how we live and relate to others. While heartbreak feels like an ending, it is also a beginning. It marks the start of a new chapter where we have the opportunity to grow stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. The heart that once felt broken can rebuild itself into something more whole, not by forgetting the past, but by integrating the lessons learned into the fabric of our being. This integration is a slow and delicate process. It requires kindness toward ourselves and the willingness to face difficult emotions without judgment. As we move through this process, the sharp edges of pain soften, and the memories transform from wounds into sources of strength and insight. At its core, heartbreak teaches us about the impermanence of life and the preciousness of love. It reminds us that to love is to risk loss, but also to experience the richness of connection and meaning. It calls us to live fully even when the outcome is uncertain and to trust that the heart has an extraordinary capacity to heal and love again. You may feel lost or broken now, but know that this too shall pass. The pain will not last forever. The heart is resilient, and with time and care, it will open again to new joys, new relationships, and new hopes. Your story of heartbreak is not just a tale of suffering. It is a story of courage, endurance, and transformation. Sharing this story can bring comfort to others who feel alone in their pain. It can create a community where people find hope and healing through connection and understanding. This is why your journey matters. Why your channel can be a light for those navigating the darkness of heartbreak. Your words can be a balm for weary souls, reminding them that they are not alone, that their pain is real, but also that healing is possible. Heartbreak is the great paradox of life, a moment when loss and growth meet. When we face it fully with honesty and compassion, we do not just survive, we thrive. We become more deeply human, more awake, and more capable of love in all its beautiful complexity. As we move beyond the initial storm of heartbreak, we enter a quieter, but no less challenging, phase. The confusion and chaos begin to settle, but they often give way to lingering loneliness and a sense of emptiness. Many try to fill this void quickly, seeking distractions or new relationships, hoping to escape the pain. But true healing demands a different approach. It requires us to be still and face the emptiness directly, without fear or avoidance. Philosophy encourages us to see this emptiness not as a curse, but as a space of possibility. When everything familiar falls away, we are invited to rediscover who we are beneath the layers of expectation and attachment. This process of self-discovery can feel like wandering in a dark forest without a clear path, but it is also an opportunity to find new light within ourselves. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously said that you cannot step into the same river twice. The river flows and changes constantly, just as we do. Our identity is not fixed, but shaped by our experiences, including heartbreak. Every loss reshapes us in subtle ways. Sometimes these changes are painful and difficult to accept, but they are necessary for growth. Nietzsche called this process the forging of the self through hardship. He urged us to embrace our fate, even its darkest parts, and to transform suffering into strength. This concept, known as amor fati or love of fate, is not about passive acceptance, but about actively choosing to find meaning in every experience, even loss. When we adopt this attitude, heartbreak becomes a catalyst for transformation rather than destruction. In this phase of healing, we learn to cultivate patience and compassion for ourselves. The mind often wants immediate answers and relief, but emotional growth unfolds on its own timetable. Like a tree growing slowly toward the sun, our hearts need time to stretch and heal gently. There will be days when grief feels overwhelming and days when a quiet hope begins to take root. Practices drawn from philosophy and mindfulness can support this process. Mindfulness teaches us to stay present with our feelings rather than getting lost in regrets about the past or worries about the future. When we observe our emotions without judgment, we create a space where healing can naturally occur. Meditation allows us to calm the restless mind and connect to a deeper sense of peace. Journaling can help us articulate our thoughts and track our progress as we move through the pain. As the heart softens, it also becomes more open and generous. We begin to understand that heartbreak is not only about losing someone else, but about reconnecting with ourselves. This reconnection leads to greater self-awareness and self-love, which are essential for building healthy relationships in the future. When we honor our own needs and boundaries, we are better equipped to love authentically and wisely. Another profound lesson of heartbreak is the recognition of impermanence. Nothing in life remains the same, including love and relationships. This awareness can be unsettling, but it also teaches us to cherish the present moment more deeply. It invites us to appreciate the beauty and fragility of human connection while it lasts, and to release attachment when it changes. Through heartbreak, we also come to appreciate the interconnectedness of all human beings. Our pain is part of the shared human experience, and it binds us together in ways we often overlook. When we share our stories of love, loss, and healing, we create bonds that transcend loneliness and isolation. This sense of belonging can be a powerful source of comfort and strength. Eventually, the emptiness left by heartbreak begins to fill with new meaning and hope. We find ways to carry the memories not as burdens, but as treasures that shape who we are. Our hearts expand to hold both joy and sorrow, gratitude and longing. This integration is the essence of resilience, the capacity to bounce back and continue growing despite adversity. It is important to remember that healing does not mean forgetting. The wounds of heartbreak remain as part of our story, but they no longer define us. They become threads woven into the rich tapestry of our life, giving texture and depth to our experience. When we embrace this fullness, we live more deeply and love more fully. Your journey through heartbreak is a testament to the strength and beauty of the human spirit. It is a story of courage, patience, and transformation that can inspire others who face similar struggles. By sharing your reflections and insights, you create a space where healing is possible and where love can flourish once again. This is the heart of what philosophy offers to those who suffer. It is not just abstract ideas, but practical wisdom for living through pain and emerging stronger on the other side. It reminds us that we are not alone in our suffering and that every ending carries within it the seed of a new beginning. As the journey through heartbreak reaches its later stages, we begin to understand that healing is not about erasing the past or pretending the pain never happened. Rather, it is about integrating the experience into the whole story of who we are. The scars left by heartbreak are not signs of brokenness, but badges of survival and growth. They tell a story of a heart that dared to love and the courage to face loss and sorrow with honesty. Philosophy teaches us that life itself is a constant flow of beginnings and endings, moments of joy and moments of grief. These opposites coexist like the changing seasons, reminding us that nothing is permanent and everything is in motion. When we accept this flow, we become more flexible and resilient. We learn to embrace change rather than resist it, and in doing so, we find freedom from suffering. The ancient Taoist philosophy offers a beautiful metaphor for this process. The Tao is often described as the natural flow of life, like water that adapts to whatever it encounters. Water is soft yet powerful. It yields to obstacles, but over time it wears them down. It teaches us that strength lies not in resistance but in flexibility and acceptance. In healing from heartbreak, we too become like water, flowing around the stones of pain, gradually carving a new path. This acceptance does not mean passivity or giving up on love. Rather, it means trusting the natural rhythms of life and our own inner wisdom. We begin to understand that love is not a possession, but a living force that changes and evolves. Love is found not only in romantic relationships but in friendship, family, and most importantly, in our relationship with ourselves. The heart that has experienced heartbreak often emerges with a deeper capacity to love more authentically. It learns to appreciate the present moment without clinging to what was or fearing what might be. This maturity brings a sense of peace and gratitude, even amidst uncertainty. It teaches us to love fully, knowing that loss is always a possibility, and yet still choosing to open ourselves again and again. In this place of wisdom and compassion, we also discover the importance of forgiveness. Forgiving others and ourselves frees us from the chains of bitterness and regret. It is a gift we give, not to excuse mistakes, but to release the heavy burden of carrying pain unnecessarily. Forgiveness opens the heart and creates space for new beginnings and new connections. Healing from heartbreak is not a destination but a lifelong journey. It changes shape and rhythm over time. Sometimes the pain resurfaces like a wave, but with each return, it feels less overwhelming and more manageable. We learn to ride these waves with greater skill and calmness, trusting that the storm will pass and the sun will shine again. The transformative power of heartbreak lies in its ability to teach us about our true nature and our place in the world. It reminds us that to be human is to be vulnerable and imperfect, yet capable of immense strength and love. This paradox is the heart of the human condition and the essence of what philosophy seeks to understand and express. Your channel has the power to be a beacon for those walking this difficult path. It can be a place where people find not only knowledge but also comfort and connection. A place where the lonely can feel seen, the broken can feel hopeful, and the weary can find strength. By sharing stories of heartbreak and healing, you help others see that pain is not the end of the story, but a chapter in a larger narrative of growth and renewal. Your words can inspire courage, patience, and self-compassion, reminding listeners that they are not alone and that healing is possible. In the end, heartbreak becomes more than just an experience of loss. It becomes a doorway to greater self-awareness, deeper love, and a richer, more meaningful life. It teaches us that even in the darkest moments there is light, and that every ending holds the promise of a new beginning. So hold on to this hope and carry it forward. Let your heart be open and brave. Let your story be a source of healing and inspiration for others. Remember that your pain is real, your courage is remarkable, and your capacity to love is endless. You have already taken the hardest step by facing heartbreak with honesty and courage. The path ahead may still have challenges, but it also holds the possibility of joy, love, and profound peace. Your journey is unique, beautiful, and deeply human, and it deserves to be honored and shared. When people imagine spiritual awakening, they often picture a burst of light, a flood of clarity, a sudden rush of meaning. The promise sounds intoxicating. To see through illusions, to rise above suffering, to feel at one with the whole of existence. And yet the reality, as Carl Jung observed, is often far less euphoric. Many who undergo such a shift report something far colder. A deep stillness that feels indistinguishable from emptiness, and a loss of motivation that seems to hollow out the will itself. Why does this happen? To understand, we must start with Jung's understanding of the psyche. He did not believe awakening meant escaping the world, nor dissolving into pure spirit. He saw it as a radical confrontation between the conscious ego and the vast unconscious depths. In the moment of awakening, what collapses first is illusion. The old scaffolding that held up your ambitions, your desires, your everyday goals, is torn away. Suddenly the things that once compelled you, career success, social approval, personal victories, appear paper-thin, like theater props under the harsh light of awareness. It is this collapse of illusion that leaves so many feeling paralyzed. Motivation, after all, depends on belief. To chase wealth, you must believe wealth will bring fulfillment. To strive for recognition, you must believe recognition matters. But after awakening, those beliefs are no longer convincing. They ring hollow, like a story you can no longer suspend disbelief for. The curtain has been pulled back, and the actors revealed. Jung described this state as a confrontation with the self. Not the small, everyday self that carries your name and your habits, but the larger totality of what you are, conscious and unconscious together. When this self emerges, it eclipses the ego. And in that eclipse, the ego's projects, its motivations, its ambitions, lose their grip. This is why so many speak of awakening as both liberating and terrifying. It frees you from illusion, but in the same breath, it robs you of the fuel that once moved you forward. The silence that follows is not laziness. It is not a failure of willpower. It is the natural consequence of seeing through the old order of things. Imagine a man who has been climbing a mountain all his life, certain that at the summit he will find a temple of gold. Then one day, a storm clears the sky, and he sees from where he stands that there is no temple, only rock and mist. Tell him to keep climbing, and he will not move. Not because he is weak, but because he knows there is nothing left to reach. This is why Jung warned that awakening is not an endpoint, but a dangerous threshold. The collapse of illusion leaves the soul in a vulnerable space, exposed and raw, with no map to follow. Many confuse this state with failure, calling it apathy or depression. But Jung understood it as part of a deeper process, one that could not be rushed. The psyche, having shed its illusions, must slowly reorient itself toward a new source of meaning. A meaning not imposed from outside, but born from within. It is here that the archetypal journey begins, in the silence after awakening. The old world has dissolved, and with it, the familiar structures of motivation. You are left staring into a kind of inner void, waiting for something new to emerge. Jung called this the encounter with the unconscious, a descent into the unknown that cannot be avoided. It is the task of individuation. To integrate what lies beneath the surface, to reconcile the fragments of the psyche, and to discover a life driven not by illusion, but by the deeper truth of the self. And so, when you find yourself without motivation after awakening, you are not lost. You are standing at the edge of an ancient threshold that countless souls before you have crossed. The silence you feel is not emptiness, but space. A space where the old has died, and the new has not yet been born. Carl Jung believed that the loss of motivation after awakening is not a mistake, but a signal. It marks the beginning of what he called individuation. This is the process by which the human being turns inward, faces the unconscious, and begins to integrate what was hidden. It is not a path of external achievement. It is a descent, a journey into the unknown layers of the soul. When the ego loses its drive, it feels like death. The familiar engine of life no longer works. You wake up, but there is no hunger to chase the day. You see others rushing toward their goals, and you wonder why you feel only stillness. Jung understood this not as weakness, but as the psyche preparing for something deeper. The old fuel was meant to run out, because it was borrowed energy, drawn from illusions. Now the psyche demands a new source of strength, one rooted in truth rather than appearances. This is why the void feels unbearable. It is the place where the ego has no control. The unconscious rises like a dark sea, and the small boat of the ego drifts without direction. To resist this silence is to create torment. But to allow it is to step into a mystery. Jung often described this as an initiation. Like the ancient rites where one had to pass through darkness before being reborn, the psyche too must undergo its symbolic night. In this night the unconscious speaks. It speaks in dreams, in sudden moods, in strange images that surface without warning. These are not distractions. They are messages from the depths, fragments of what the ego has ignored or denied. Jung saw them as archetypes, ancient patterns of human experience that dwell in every soul. When motivation disappears, it is often because these deeper patterns are demanding to be heard. The old ambitions were too shallow to carry their weight. Think of it as a kind of inner rebellion. The unconscious refuses to supply energy for goals that do not serve the whole self. The ego may want prestige, but the deeper self wants truth. The ego may want speed, but the deeper self wants depth. Until these forces are reconciled, motivation remains absent. It is not that the well is dry. It is that the water has withdrawn underground, waiting for you to dig in the right place. This is why so many who awaken feel drawn to solitude. Silence becomes heavy, but also strangely necessary. The outer world continues its noise, but inwardly there is a pull to listen to something softer, something not yet clear. Jung believed that honoring this silence is crucial. To run back into distractions, to force old ambitions, is to abandon the work of individuation. The psyche will not forgive such avoidance. It will withhold energy until its demands are met. So the loss of motivation, painful as it is, serves a hidden purpose. It strips away the false so that the true may appear. The ego, once master, must now learn humility. It must yield to the unconscious, to the wisdom that lies in the depths. This is not easy. It feels like drowning. But it is in this drowning that the possibility of rebirth is hidden. The descent into the unknown is not the end of the story. It is the middle passage, the long night before the dawn. Jung reminded us that meaning does not come quickly, and that the soul's growth cannot be forced. What appears as emptiness is actually preparation. The ground is being cleared, the old structures torn down, so that something new can take root. And so, if awakening has left you without motivation, remember this. The silence is not punishment. It is invitation. The descent is not failure. It is transformation. You are entering the night sea journey, where the old self dissolves, and the deeper self begins to stir. In Jung's vision, the descent into the unconscious is never meant to leave us stranded forever. The psyche does not destroy without purpose. What feels like emptiness is the soil where a new kind of energy begins to grow. But this energy does not come as the old motivation did. It does not surge from the ego's hunger for achievement. It comes quietly, from the deeper rhythms of the self. Jung believed that meaning is the true source of psychic energy. Not meaning in the shallow sense of entertainment or distraction, but meaning that roots itself in the soul, meaning that connects the individual with something greater than personal gain. When awakening strips away illusions, it is not leaving you empty for its own sake. It is making space for meaning that cannot be faked. At first, this new energy is fragile. It does not announce itself with fireworks. It appears as a faint pull towards something unexpected. A sudden interest in a book, a quiet impulse to paint, a longing to walk alone in the woods. These are not trivial. They are the first movements of the deeper self, testing the waters, offering small signals that a new direction is possible. The ego, impatient, may dismiss them as nothing. But Jung urged patience. What is fragile now, if tended to, becomes the seed of transformation. This is the crucial difference between the old and the new. Old motivation was driven by comparison, by competition, by the desire to keep pace with the world. New energy emerges from within, without reference to others. It does not shout. It whispers. And the more one listens, the stronger it becomes. Jung often said that the psyche seeks wholeness. Every dream, every impulse, every symbol that surfaces carries this hidden aim. The unconscious does not drain us of energy to be cruel. It withdraws energy from false pursuits so that it may redirect us toward wholeness. This is why, After awakening, the person cannot simply return to chasing the same goals as before. The energy will not flow. The soul has already outgrown them. The return of energy is not linear. There are days when the silence remains heavy, when nothing seems to move. And then suddenly, without warning, a small spark appears. A sense of beauty where before there was only numbness. A feeling of depth in a simple act, like listening to music or watching the sky. These moments, fleeting as they are, mark the return of life force. They are the psyche's way of saying, here is the direction. Follow this thread. In following such threads, something unexpected happens. The person begins to feel carried, rather than pushing forward. Motivation is replaced by something subtler, something Jung compared to alignment. Instead of forcing oneself to chase goals, one begins to move with the natural current of the self. Life becomes less about striving, and more about responding. The will is not destroyed, but it is reoriented. It is no longer the ego dictating from above, but the deeper self guiding from within. This transformation can feel disorienting, because the world praises visible ambition, measurable success, and restless striving. But Jung insisted that true vitality cannot be measured in such terms. A person aligned with the self may appear quieter, even withdrawn, yet within them flows a depth of energy unknown to the one who is endlessly chasing illusions. The birth of new energy is the turning point. It is the moment the darkness begins to reveal its purpose. The silence, once unbearable, becomes a container. The emptiness, once frightening, becomes fertile ground. Out of the collapse of old illusions, something genuine begins to rise. But Jung was clear. This process is not about achieving perfection or permanent bliss. It is about becoming whole. The return of energy marks not an escape from struggle, but the beginning of a new relationship with it. The unconscious has been heard, and in listening, life begins to flow in a different way. As this new energy begins to take shape, the world itself seems to change. What once appeared rigid and oppressive starts to feel open, as though hidden pathways are being revealed. Jung observed that when the self begins to guide the psyche, life reorganizes itself around deeper patterns. Relationships, work, creativity, even solitude, all begin to carry a new significance. The first change often appears in relationships. Old bonds that were sustained only by habit or by social expectations start to feel thin. The awakened soul no longer has the energy to maintain masks or to play roles that betray its truth. Some friendships may dissolve quietly. Some connections may fall away with painful clarity. But this is not cruelty. It is a release. It makes space for bonds that carry depth rather than convenience, bonds that align with the wholeness now stirring within. Creativity too begins to take on a different quality. Before, it may have been driven by ambition or recognition. Now it becomes an expression of inner necessity. Jung often said that art, writing, and imagination are ways in which the unconscious speaks. When the old motivation dies, these channels can open in unexpected ways. A person who never painted may find themselves sketching. A person who never wrote may feel compelled to put words on paper. This is not about talent or outcome. It is about listening to the stirrings of the soul, allowing what lies beneath to surface without judgment. Purpose itself also begins to shift. In the world of illusions, purpose is usually defined by external standards. Success is measured by wealth, status, or the approval of others. After awakening, those standards lose their power. Purpose becomes quieter, less dramatic, but far more enduring. It may appear in small acts of kindness, in the patient tending of daily life, in work that resonates with inner truth rather than outer applause. Jung believed that this kind of purpose is not chosen by the ego. It emerges naturally, as the self aligns with the outer world. This new orientation does not remove struggle. In fact, Jung warned that the path of individuation often brings its own trials. The unconscious does not only carry light. It also carries shadow, the parts of ourselves we have denied or rejected. As energy returns, these shadows surface. They appear in anger, in fear, in envy, in all the aspects of the self that feel uncomfortable to face. But here too lies transformation. To see one's shadow without judgment, to integrate it rather than repress it, is the very heart of becoming whole. The loss of motivation after awakening makes sense in this light. It was the necessary collapse that cleared the stage. Without that collapse, the old illusions would have continued to dominate. The silence was preparation. The emptiness was space being carved out for something larger. Now, as new energy rises, life no longer flows according to the plans of the ego alone. It begins to follow a deeper rhythm, one that moves between light and shadow, creation and destruction, silence and expression. Jung often compared this rhythm to nature. A tree does not strive to grow by sheer willpower. It grows because the seasons guide it, because the roots draw nourishment, because the sun and rain arrive in their time. The human soul, when aligned with the self, follows a similar rhythm. There are seasons of stillness and seasons of growth, and both are necessary. This is why the return of energy after awakening feels different from ordinary ambition. It is no longer about endless striving. It is about harmony. One begins to sense when to act and when to rest, when to speak and when to listen, when to move outward into the world and when to turn inward again. The will becomes less like a clenched fist and more like an open hand. In this way, the soul is reshaped. Life no longer feels like a battle against the current, but like a dialogue with it. Each experience, whether joyful or painful, carries meaning. Each silence, each spark of creativity, each change in relationship, becomes part of a larger unfolding. And the person who once felt empty, who once mourned the loss of motivation, begins to see that they have not lost life at all. They have only lost illusion. Carl Jung believed that the true aim of human life is not happiness in the shallow sense, but wholeness. To be whole means to embrace all that one is, the light and the shadow, the conscious and the unconscious, the ego and the self. It is a state that does not deny suffering, but weaves it into meaning. It does not cling to illusions, but accepts life as it is. The loss of motivation after awakening, painful though it may be, is part of this larger unfolding. It clears away what is false so that the fullness of the soul may finally emerge. Wholeness does not arrive as a single moment of triumph. It reveals itself gradually, in the quiet recognition that life is no longer lived on the surface alone. The person who has passed through awakening, who has endured the silence and the void, who has listened to the stirrings of the unconscious, begins to carry a new depth. Their energy no longer burns chaotically. It flows steadily, like a river finding its course. This new way of being is not concerned with perfection. Jung was clear that perfection is an illusion of the ego. Wholeness is different. It allows contradictions to exist. It accepts that the soul contains opposites, and that true growth is not about erasing them, but about holding them together. The awakened person does not live without struggle, but the struggle is no longer meaningless. Each challenge is seen as part of the dialogue between ego and self, between the surface and the depths. In this sense, motivation is reborn in a new form. It is no longer the restless drive to chase what society promises will bring fulfillment. It becomes a steady commitment to live truthfully, to honor the inner voice, to act in harmony with the self. This motivation may appear subtle from the outside. It does not always shout or display itself. But it carries a strength that endures where ambition collapses. Those who pass through this transformation often describe a strange paradox. Outwardly, they may appear quieter, less concerned with proving themselves. Yet inwardly, they feel more alive than ever. The emptiness that once terrified them has become space for something vast and unshakable. The silence that once felt unbearable has become a source of clarity. What was once seen as the end is revealed as a beginning. Jung often reminded us that the self is not something we invent. It is something that has always been present, waiting beneath the noise of the ego. Spiritual awakening tears away the noise. The loss of motivation is the psyche's way of refusing to return to illusions. It is the doorway through which one enters a deeper life. And in walking through it, the individual does not become detached from the world. On the contrary, they begin to live more fully within it, with a sense of meaning that no external achievement can provide. The fulfillment of wholeness is not a prize given at the end of struggle. It is a way of being that grows slowly, like roots sinking deeper into the earth. It brings resilience in suffering, humility in success, and clarity in silence. It does not promise eternal comfort, but it does promise depth. And in that depth, life finds a steadiness that no illusion can shake. So if awakening has left you in silence, if it has taken from you the old motivations that once pushed you forward, know this. You are not broken. You are in the midst of the oldest journey the human soul can take. The illusions have fallen away, and what feels like emptiness is the space where truth begins to live. To pass through this space is to be remade, not as a perfect being, but as a whole one. And this, Jung believed, is the deepest fulfillment of human life. Not to escape the world, not to cling to illusions, but to live in the flow of wholeness, where every silence, every struggle, and every spark of meaning becomes part of a life that is finally, fully alive.